Romantic Tales. Chapter 319. Mu Yang stared at her unwillingly. How do you know that it can't be reunited? Yili said, I don't know if there is such a thing as a broken mirror being reunited, but the bronze mirror, even if it is reunited, it can't cover up the previous crack. Also, does Shitzi really have a way to get the best of both worlds? Mu Yang's face showed a trace of frustration and annoyance. Yili didn't say anything else and turned to leave. She lightly recited, I once worried too much about love harming Fan Xing, but when I entered the mountain I feared that I would lose a city. Is there a way to get the best of both worlds, to live up to Tathagata and Qing? Is there a way to get the best of both worlds? Mu Yang softly recited with a faint bitter smile on his lips. He would never be able to convince Yaoji to become a concubine of Marquis Mu Yang's household, just like he would never be able to convince his proud parents to accept Yaoji as their daughter-in-law. Live up to Tathagata and Qing. Did the person who wrote this poem also experience the same struggle and pain as him? The next morning the Xiling army didn't attack again, which was rare. Yili sat in the study and sorted out the news and analysis of the battle. Marquis Nan didn't say that he couldn't do anything to decline. Early in the morning when Yili just got up, someone came to report that Marquis Nan was seriously ill. Although there weren't any famous doctors in Jiangxia City, fortunately, the medical skills of the Mo family army's military doctors were extremely good. They quickly went over to diagnose and treat the Marquis and reported back to Yili. Although the southern Marquis wasn't very old, he had been living like a prince all year round. Therefore he was too tired and anxious during the march, which caused him to suddenly fall ill. Helpless, Yili could only send people to take care of him and speed up the search for Marquis Nan's heir. Qin Feng just finished his mission and secretly returned to Jiangxia last night. Yili called him to the study early in the morning and told him to look for Marquis Nan's heir. Princess, Officer Yun is fighting with someone at the military field. Just as she was talking to Qin Feng, someone rushed in from outside the door to report. Yili raised her eyebrows and smiled. She turned to Qin Feng and Zhuojing and said, We have been on the road for several days. Yesterday we had a big fight, but this morning we were able to get up and fight. It seems that we have underestimated the abilities of our Mahist army. Zhuojing rubbed his nose and laughed in a low voice. He said, Wang Fei is right. Yili rose and rubbed her shoulders. She said, Since that's the case, let's go take a look. Because it was the time when the two armies were facing each other, the Mahist army's barracks were stationed in an open space not far from Jiangxia City. All around there were soldiers guarding the roads. An empty space in the middle of the barracks was used as a temporary drill ground. By the time Yili and the others arrived, Yun Ting was already wrestling with a young general of similar age. There were also a few high-ranking Mahist army generals and many soldiers standing at the side. Mu Yang, who had been watching from the side, was the first to see Yili come in. He turned his head and smiled at her. Yili nodded slightly. Qin Feng and Zhuojing parted the crowd to make a path. Everyone looked at the two young but outstanding generals fighting fiercely. Many people didn't even notice that Yili had walked to the front. Wang Fei. It was Mu Yang who spoke. The people who had been watching from the side finally recovered. Their expressions changed slightly as they hurriedly bowed to Yili. Some people wanted to go forward and pull the two people apart. Yili waved her hand and said with a smile, No matter. Let's wait until they have decided the victor. Although Yili said so, with the presence of the princess consort, the bustling and lively atmosphere in the school ground suddenly dissipated. Many people had awkward and reserved expressions on their faces. Yili didn't care. She smiled and turned to ask Mu Yang, who was standing next to her, Mu Shitzi, who do you think has a better chance of winning? Mu Yang smiled and raised an eyebrow as he said, This one thinks that Field Officer Yun Ting has a better chance. Instantly, the generals beside him all revealed unconvinced expressions. One of them had already blurted out, From what I see, Field Commandant Chen is still more powerful. When he said this, everyone saw that there wasn't any displeasure on Yili's face. They couldn't help but feel relieved. They all spoke out in support of the young field officer surnamed Chen. Mu Yang said in a low voice to Yili with a smile, Wang Fei, it seems that the Mahist army is also very xenophobic. Yun Ting was also a member of the Mahist army, and he was one that Princess Ding had personally cultivated. But after all, he was a newbie who came out of nowhere. Soldiers were all proud and arrogant. Naturally, there were many people who didn't like him. Yili didn't care. She smiled faintly and said, in the military camp the strong are the kings. It's not a bad thing to occasionally learn from each other. As long as it doesn't affect the important matters, it's fine. When she was in the special forces in her previous life, any random soldier was the elite of the military. How could there be no competition when such a group of elites were squeezed together? And it was because of this competition that they worked harder to move forward. Because the weak would be eliminated in the end. For the same reason, many of the generals in the Mahist army were promoted from ordinary soldiers. There were also some who had served the Ding king's household for generations. Although Yun Ting had made contributions in the Battle of Yonglin, it wasn't worth mentioning to the soldiers of the Mahist army. Not to mention that he was promoted by her, the Wang Fei, who didn't know the depth of his abilities. Mu Yang deeply looked at Yili and chuckled softly. Wang Fei is right. The two people who were fighting in the middle of the field finally noticed that something was wrong with the onlookers outside. As soon as they looked back, they saw Yili standing on the side and looking at them with interest. Yun Ting's face was embarrassed. For a moment he was careless and was punched by the other side. However, the other side still had a sense of awe for the princess consort of Ding. After they succeeded, they no longer entangled. The two people quickly separated. They just stared at each other to let people know that they were still very dissatisfied with each other. Yili raised her hand and high-fived. She looked at the two with a smile and said, "Why did you stop?" Wang Fei. Yun Ting lowered his head in shame. In the past few months he had been convinced by Princess Ding. He was also proud of being able to be promoted and cultivated by the Wang Fei. Therefore, when faced with the contemptuous attitude of several young generals in the Mahist army, he was so easily angered that he actually fought with them in a fit of anger. Yili smiled and said, "It's okay. It's common for everyone to learn from each other in the military camp. Don't be embarrassed. Or, is Ben Fei hindering you from playing?" As soon as these words came out, the several generals standing on the side couldn't help blushing. If they didn't have doubts about Yun Ting and even about Wang Fei's ability, they wouldn't have let the two people fight like this. Now, looking at Wang Fei's attitude, it seemed that these 7-foot men were narrow-minded. Yili saw that they didn't intend to fight, so she smiled and waved her hand to let the soldiers around her disperse. She took several generals to the big tent in the military camp. Right now, Lu Jingxian was in charge of the military camp outside the city. However, he had gone into the city early in the morning to discuss the defense with the guards in the city. He wasn't in the camp, so no one cared when the two field officers fought. Lu Jingxian had hurried back as soon as he received the news in the city, but he was still a step slower than Yili. He could only glare at Field Officer Chen with a dark face and go forward to ask for forgiveness. Chapter 320. Yili's laughter was clear and melodious. She raised a hand to indicate for Zhuojing to help Lu Jingxian up. She smiled and said, "General Lu, you don't have to be like this. Young people only need to know their limits. Just treat fighting as bonding." The group of people returned to the large tent and sat down. Lu Jingxian called Field Officer Chen in front of him to ask about the reason for the fight. It was not a rare thing to fight in the military, but if they wanted to fight, they could do it on the practice field or the arena. It was not proper to fight in front of normal soldiers regardless of the situation. It was easy for the soldiers to think that the relationship between the generals was not good. Field Officer Chen glanced sideways at Yun Ting and snorted lightly. He did not respond to Lu Jingxian's words. Yun Ting was once again provoked by his snort of disdain. He raised his chin and said, "You don't agree? If you don't agree, we can fight again." Field Officer Chen smiled coldly and said with a raised eyebrow, "You think he is afraid of you? If it wasn't for, he would beat you until you were looking for your teeth on the ground. Boasting shamelessly, aren't you afraid of the wind biting your tongue?" Yun Ting mocked. "Shut up." Lu Jingxian was furious. It was one thing for two field officers to fight in front of so many generals and Princess Ding, but they were cursing in public. They had no regard for the law. Yili put down the teacup in her hand and said with a faint smile to Lu Jingxian, "General Lu, calm down. It is inevitable that young people are young and impetuous. General does not need to be angry." Yun Ting, after staying in Jing for a few months to say nothing else, "Your mouth has become much sharper?" Yun Ting's face twisted. He was considered young in the military, but he was still a few years older than Dingguo Wang Fei. Being called young and impetuous by Princess Ding, who was younger than him, he couldn't help but feel his face heat up. He lowered his head and said, "This subordinate has been rash. Wang Fei, please punish me." Ben Fei said, "I don't blame you, so I don't blame you." Yili said, "Why don't you tell me why the two of you are sparring so early in the morning?" Commandant Qin and Yun Ting had a rare moment of hesitation. They looked at Yili without saying anything. Yili frowned. "What? Can't he say it? Or should I ask the generals who were present?" Field Officer Chen took a step forward and gritted his teeth. "This subordinate should not have spoken disrespectfully to Wang Fei, so I had a conflict with Field Officer Yun. Wang Fei, please punish me. This subordinate is willing to accept any punishment." Yili stared at him for a moment and then nodded, saying, "You dare to take responsibility for your actions." Commandant Qin remained silent. Yun Ting looked at everyone and also took a step forward. "This subordinate is also in the wrong. I'm willing to be punished together with Commandant Qin." Looking at Yun Ting's young face, Yili nodded inwardly. There were benefits to learning and teaching for a few months. If it was a few months ago with Yun Ting's personality, he definitely would not ask for punishment at this time. There was no other reason other than that he understood how to conduct himself better. The Mahist army were not unreasonable people. Seeing Yun Ting say this, their expressions became much better. After a moment of silence, Yili said in a light voice, "Ben Fei has just taken control of the Mahist army and has not met any of the generals before. It is understandable that everyone is dissatisfied. Therefore this matter will be let go. Right now, if anyone here still has any dissatisfaction, you can speak it out. Everyone here is a true hero who has fought on the battlefield for many years. Let's not learn from those roundabout things in the imperial court." Seeing that everyone was hesitating, Yili smiled and said, "In this tent the one who speaks is not guilty. If you have any thoughts, speak. Or are you all afraid that Ben Fei will retaliate after this?" Everyone was silent for a while. A middle-aged deputy general stood up and raised his hands towards Yili, saying, "Wang Fei, please forgive us. The original Master I is not here, so it is natural that Wang Fei is in command of the Mahist army. But war is not like anything else. It is the lives of tens of thousands of brothers. Therefore this subordinate has thought more. Wang Fei is still young and was born into a scholarly family. This..." Yili listened to her subordinate's words and nodded with a smile to show that she understood. The other people saw that she did not show any signs of anger and gathered their courage to stand and voice their doubts. It was just that Yili was still young and they had doubts about Yili's ability to lead troops and skills. Yili sat in the chair and silently waited for everyone to finish speaking. Then she smiled brightly and said, "Ben Fei only now knows that the generals have so many worries and worries. It really is Ben Fei's fault. Field Officer Chen, is it because of this that you are dissatisfied with Ben Fei?" Field Officer Chen stiffened his neck and said, "War is not child's play. If Wang Fei doesn't have true ability, this little general will naturally be dissatisfied." "Qin Yun, impudent!" Lu Jingxian shouted. Yili waved her hand and said with a smile, "No matter. Ben Fei specializes in dealing with dissatisfaction. How about we go to the school field first to see who is better?" This subordinate does not dare. Field Officer Qin Yun was clearly frightened by Yili's words and knelt on the ground with a thump. The generals of the Mahist army might have doubts about Wang Fei's ability to lead the Mahist army, but they were still very respectful of her status as the Ding Wang Fei. But the lives of the soldiers on the battlefield were more important to the outcome of the war. So they would not blindly trust her ability because of her status as the Ding Wang Fei. Now that Wang Fei said she wanted to compete with him, how could Qin Yun dare to act against his superior? Yili stood up and said faintly, "Get up. You're a man. Don't kneel just because you want to. What? Is it that a man like you is afraid of Ben Fei, a woman?" Qin Yun's face turned red. For a moment he didn't know if he should say he was afraid or not. Yili smiled slightly and walked out of the tent without caring about him. When Yili left, the others could only follow. Qin Yun looked helplessly at Lu Jingxian, who was walking at the back. "General." Lu Jingxian shook his head and sighed, "Let's go. Don't let Wang Fei wait for you." Yun Ting, who had already reached the door, turned his head and smiled at Qin Yun with some schadenfreude. Other people did not know of Wang Fei's skills, but he had seen it with his own eyes. If Qin Yun still wanted to go easy, he would definitely die a horrible death. On the school field, Yili stood with her hands behind her back. She smiled as she looked at Qin Yun, who was hesitating. Unknowingly, many soldiers who had finished their training had gathered in the surroundings. Seeing Qin Yun was still hesitating, Yili smiled and said, "Field Officer Qin, please come up." Qin Yun finally walked onto the school field. He did not look as spirited and vicious as when he had fought with Yun Ting. Instead, he appeared very restrained. He looked at Yili and said, "Wang Fei, after you." Yili raised an eyebrow slightly. She knew that if she did not act, Qin Yun would not dare to act against her. She smiled and said, "If that's the case, Field Officer Qin, be careful." Yili did not use the dagger she was used to. She turned and took a long sword from Zhuojing, who was standing at the side. The tip of the sword trembled and turned into a cold light as it shot towards Qin Yun. Qin Yun moved his body to the side to dodge the flying sword. Yili smiled and swept her long sword horizontally. In a blink, Yili had swung her sword a few times. Qin Yun was forced back a few steps at the same time. When the soldiers below the stage saw Qin Yun like this, they naturally booed. Qin Yun had originally planned to let Yili exchange a few blows and then find a chance to admit defeat. This way he would not embarrass himself or Yili. But when Yili swung her first blow, he knew he was wrong. No matter if it was the posture of Wang Fei holding the sword or the angle of the blow, it was not just for show. In fact, each blow was very dangerous. But if he had not been nimble enough to dodge quickly, and if Wang Fei had not held back her strength, he would have had a few holes in his body. Chapter 321. Qin Yun flipped and quickly retreated to a safe distance. Yili did not chase after him. She put away her sword and stood in the middle of the field to look at him. Qin Yun raised his hands and said, "This subordinate has eyes but cannot see. Wang Fei, please forgive this subordinate." This subordinate dares to ask Wang Fei to redo the match. Finishing, he walked to the weapon rack at the side and took down a long spear. Shaking it in his hand, he stared at Yili with a serious expression. Yili nodded in satisfaction and said, "Very good, this is right. Field Officer Qin, please." "Excuse me," Qin Yun said loudly. The long spear in his hand stabbed straight at Yili. Yili nimbly stepped out of the way and the long sword in her hand danced beautifully. It was said that an inch longer was an inch stronger. The 3-chi long sword in Yili's hand did not have any advantage against the long spear in Qin Yun's hand. But the people below the stage quickly found that Wang Fei had kept the distance between the two within a certain range. And this distance greatly limited the advantage of the long spear in Qin Yun's movements. For a time they were evenly matched. Below the stage, Feng Jiao, who had arrived at an unknown time, lazily stood beside Mu Yang with his arms crossed. He asked with a grin, "Young Master Mu, who do you think will win between Princess Consort and Field Officer Qin?" Mu Yang smiled faintly and said, "This subordinate has had the fortune to see Princess Ding's skills. She is definitely a 1 in 10,000 expert. Field Officer Qin, I'm afraid he is still lacking a bit." Hearing Mu Yang's words, Lu Jingxian, who was at the side, turned his head to look at the two of them in surprise. Finally, his gaze fell on Feng Jiao. Feng Jiao and Lu Jingxian were old acquaintances. He did not hide it and said with a chuckle, "General Lu may not know, but Wang Fei's swordsmanship was personally taught by the prince. Also, Wang Fei is most likely the worst at swordsmanship." Hearing this, the expressions of the generals changed slightly. They had all seen Wang Fei's swordsmanship. It was not the best, but they could faintly see the murderous intent under the edge of the sword. That was a sword technique that could truly kill people, and this was said to be the one that Princess Consort was the least skilled in. In other words, Wang Fei and Qin Yun did not use their true skills. Mu Yang raised his head and looked at the graceful figure on the stage. He couldn't help but chuckle. He suddenly remembered what Yili had just said. Ai's imperial concubine specialized in dealing with all kinds of disobedience. In front of such a woman, how many people could truly be disobedient? On the stage, the two of them fought with great agility, and it was hard to tell who had the upper hand. Yili's 3-feet-long sword was like a poisonous snake, attacking Qin Yun's vital points. Qin Yun was not willing to be outdone. His long spear danced in a watertight manner, and the two of them were in a deadlock for a while. Yili looked at the young general, who had a serious expression on his face, and smiled faintly. The long sword in his hand turned into a cold rainbow that shot straight towards Qin Yun's face. Qin Yun hurriedly waved his spear to block, but he saw the long sword that had been heading towards him turn midway and move along the body of the spear. Qin Yun only paused for a moment before he felt a chill on his neck. The tip of Yi Li's sword was already at his throat, but her other hand was tightly gripping the body of his spear. Yi Li raised an eyebrow and said with a slight smile, "Field Officer Qin?" Qin Yun put down his spear and said in a low voice, "Wang Fei's swordsmanship is profound. This subordinate admits defeat." Yi Li did not make things difficult for him. She took back her long sword and threw it to Zhuo Jing, who was standing on the side of the stage. She turned and smiled at the generals below the stage. "Which other general is dissatisfied? Why don't you come up and try?" The generals looked at each other. A burly middle-aged man holding a pair of maces jumped onto the stage. He raised his hands in a bow and said, "This subordinate is Deputy General Lu Feng of the Maoist Army's Qizhou. Please teach me Wang Fei's skills." Yi Li nodded slightly and took 2 steps back. This General Lu was not like Qin Yun, who was slender and agile. With a glance, it was clear that he was a power-type opponent. Looking at his pair of maces, it was at least a few dozen caddies. It would not be comfortable to be hit by such a weapon. Yi Li was not a person who liked to flaunt her superiority, so she took out the dagger she was most comfortable with. Lu Feng looked with surprise at the dagger in Yi Li's hand that flashed with cold light. He said, "This is Wang Fei's weapon?" Yi Li nodded and said, "General Lu pleased. Then this subordinate will offend you. Wang Fei, be careful." After Lu Feng finished speaking, one of his maces swept towards Yi Li. Yi Li quickly moved out of the way. The dagger in her hand flashed with an icy light in the morning light. The people below the stage clearly found that when Yi Li had a dagger in her hand, she was clearly more dangerous than when she was holding a long sword. There were many times when Yi Li's dagger had narrowly missed Lu Feng's vital points. If it wasn't for Lu Feng's great strength, each of his moves containing an unstoppable force that forced her to dodge, Lu Feng would have been injured by that small dagger. Yi Li clearly understood Lu Feng's strengths and weaknesses. So she did not fight Lu Feng head-on. She used the advantage of her body to continuously exhaust Lu Feng's strength. At the same time, she waited for a chance to attack. Even though she did not succeed in injuring Lu Feng, she did succeed in giving him a great scare. Once again, Lu Feng raised his pair of maces and swung them towards Yi Li. Yi Li dodged to the side. She kicked in the air and her left hand slapped the ground. The dagger in her right hand went straight for Lu Feng's left shoulder. Seeing this, Lu Feng hurriedly raised his right mace. Yi Li had already flipped behind him. "General Lu." Lu Feng's body froze. The cold dagger was pressed against his back. Lu Feng had fought for many years and naturally had seen all kinds of injuries. At the same time, he knew that if Yi Li's stab was solid, he would be paralyzed for the rest of his life. Putting down the pair of maces, Lu Feng turned and bowed to Yi Li, saying, "Many thanks for Wang Fei's mercy. This general is convinced." Yi Li smiled slightly and said, "General Lu's strength is unmatched and his skills are not ordinary. Ben Fei is also very impressed." There was a moment of silence below the stage. Suddenly there was a burst of cheers. The soldiers present all cheered. After winning 2 rounds in a row, the generals were completely convinced of Yi Li's skills. Naturally, they did not challenge her again. Yi Li had already won 2 rounds in a row. If she went up again, even if she won, it would be an unfair victory. It would be a waste of the reputation of a group of men taking turns to fight against a woman. Seeing Yi Li walk down the stage, everyone quickly went up. Lu Jingxian cupped his hands and said with a smile, "Wang Fei's display of skills today has truly made this subordinate prostrate in admiration. Us rough people don't know the rules and have offended Wang Fei. I hope Wang Fei will not blame us." Yi Li smiled and said, "General Lu is too serious. There's no need to take these small matters to heart. Ben Fei still has some matters to take care of in the city. I'll have to trouble General Lu to take care of the barracks." Lu Jingxian quickly replied, "Wang Fei can be at ease." Yi Li nodded and looked at Yun Ting with a smile as she said, "Commandant Yun." Yun Ting rubbed his head and said with a bitter face, "Wang Fei, this subordinate knows his wrongs." Yi Li nodded in satisfaction and said with a smile, "Knowing one's wrongs and being able to change is the greatest virtue. Have you been reading recently?" Thinking of the days when Wang Fei had just sent him to the Maoist army and the mountain of books in his room that was even taller than a person, the smile on Yun Ting's face became even more bitter. "I've read. I just read Military Strategy." Yi Li's smile became even more amiable. "Your progress is not bad. Ben Fei just happened to need a few military strategy books to teach the soldiers. I'll have to trouble Commandant Yun to make 10 copies and give them to me in 3 days? Is Wang Fei. Yun Ting's eyes were blank and his body was stiff. His expression was dazed as he watched Yi Li turn and leave. Chapter 322. Brother, what's wrong? Qin Yun looked at his mournful appearance and patted his shoulder as he asked. Yun Ting silently looked at him, then turned around and left. If I continue to fight with you, I will be a pig. Qin Yun looked doubtfully at his back as he walked away in a daze. Then he looked at his own hands in confusion. It was just a fight, there was no need to be so petty, right? Feng Jiao walked forward, tapped his shoulder with the fan in his hand and said with a smile, "You don't need to mind, that kid is really annoyed at copying books. If Lieutenant Qin has nothing to do, you can help him write a few pages. I guarantee that he will treat you as his life's brother." Copying books. Qin Yun's face twisted a little, thinking of when he was young he was chased by his father and teacher to copy books. He quickly shook his head, "Forget it. I will go and see if there is anything to eat. When Lieutenant Yun is tired of copying, I will send it to him to make up for it." As for copying books, there was no need, his handwriting could not be seen by others. When they left the city they were in a hurry, but when they went back they were not in a hurry. Yi Li's group strolled, taking the opportunity to look at the various checkpoints and the situation of the people. Although the war was imminent, the people of Jiangxia seemed to be very at ease. They were methodically living their own lives as if there was no difference. Even if they had just experienced a bloody battle yesterday and almost lost the city. Early in the morning the people were still going out, opening their shops. There was no fear and uneasiness in their eyes. Feng Jiao walked beside Yi Li, fanning himself while explaining to Yi Li, "These people completely trust the Mahist army. They believe that as long as the Mahist army is there, the city will not be lost, their homes will not be invaded by the enemy." Yi Li sighed softly. She did not know whether to be impressed or worried. To be able to let the people have such confidence in them, the Mahist army should be proud. But when everyone had entrusted their trust and responsibility to the Mahist army, relying on them, this was a heavy pressure. It was no wonder that the successive masters of the Ding King's Fu were unable to let go of everything and retire. It was because the Ding King's Fu and the Mahist army had long become the spiritual and practical pillars of the Dechu state. If one day the Mahist army was no longer the Mahist army, would the Dechu state still be the Dechu state? "Your Highness, the emissary from West Hill wishes to see you." As soon as she walked to the entrance of the mansion, General Yuan Pei was already waiting for her. When he saw Yi Li and the others return, he hurriedly came forward to report. Yi Li frowned slightly and said, "A messenger from West Hill?" Yuan Pei nodded solemnly and said, "Just now, the West Hill emissary requested to see you outside the city. This subordinate acted on my own initiative and let them in. Right now, they are waiting in the outer courtyard for your Highness to summon them." Yi Li nodded and said, "General Yuan did well. Let's go see this West Hill emissary. To have the courage to enter Jiangxia at this time, they must not be ordinary people. Invite them to the study." Yes. Yi Li changed her clothes and returned to the study. After a while, General Yuan Pei led the West Hill emissary in. The leader was a middle-aged man with an ordinary face. Behind him was a general and 3 attendants. The group of 5 were all dressed in cloth and did not have swords. They seemed to be very confident and were not afraid to step into the city controlled by the Mahist army. The middle-aged man looked at Yi Li and stepped forward to cup his hands. "I am a guest of West Hill's Genom of Gojoseon. Mo Fei greets Princess Ding of Eastern Chu. Mr. Mo, please rise." Yi Li gently raised her hand and said with a smile, "What brings Mr. Mo here?" Mo Fei looked at the people sitting in the study and said with a smile, "Indeed, Genom of Gojoseon has some small matters to consult your Highness. But I wonder if I can speak with your Highness alone?" Yi Li smiled and said, "It's not that I can't, but it's not necessary. As the temporary commander of the Mahist army, it is inappropriate for me to speak with the enemy emissary in private. Besides, there is nothing that cannot be said. If Mr. Mo has something to say, please say it face to face." On the side, Zhuo Jing sneered and said, "Speak in private? Who knows if you are waiting for an opportunity to assassinate our princess?" Feng Jiao smiled lazily and said, "I'm afraid we don't have the ability to assassinate your Highness. But we must guard against others." Mo Fei's expression was ugly and he wanted to flare up, but he quickly suppressed it. He looked up at Yi Li and said, "Since your highness has said so, I will not force you. Presumably, the people here are your highness and the Ding Palace's trusted aides?" Yi Li nodded indifferently. Mo Fei said, "Our prince has a letter for your highness. Please take a look." After that he took out a letter from his sleeve and presented it. Zhuojing took the letter and opened it. After making sure there was no problem, he turned and handed it to Yi Li. Yi Li opened the letter and glanced at it. She looked up at Mo Fei, who was standing leisurely in the hall, and smiled faintly. She lowered her head and continued to read. After a while she looked up and slowly folded the letter and sealed it in an envelope. She calmly looked at Mo Fei. Mo Fei smiled and said, "Your Highness, what do you think about what your Highness said by the prince? What do you think?" Yi Li smiled and looked at him leisurely. She said slowly, "Come, drag this person out and behead him." Everyone was stunned. Yuan Pei looked at Feng Jiao. Feng Jiao looked sideways at Su Qingze, who was sitting on the side reading a book. Maybe because Feng Jiao's gaze was too intense, Su Qingze, who usually did not speak, put down his book and looked up at Yi Li. He said, "Little sister, the envoys are not to be killed in a battle between two armies." Yi Li smiled faintly, "Thank you for the reminder. Then Mr. Mo, will you walk out yourself or will I order people to throw you out?" Mo Fei looked at the crowd and sneered, "So this is how your Highness of Ding Country treats her guests?" Yi Li said indifferently, "Those who come are guests. I will naturally treat them as distinguished guests. But if they are thieves, I won't be polite, right?" Mo Fei raised his eyebrows and looked at her. He said, "Will your Highness really not consider our prince's proposal?" Yi Li looked down at him indifferently. Her lips curved into an extremely cold smile. "Mr. Mo, do you really think I won't kill you?" The smile on Mo Fei's face became slightly stiff. Since he could be sent as an envoy of Genom of Gojoseon to see Yi Li, he naturally had some ability. How could he not see the murderous intent and coldness hidden in the eyes of this beautiful woman in green? Mo Fei forced a smile and nodded. He said, "I understand. Since that is the case, I will leave first." Finishing, Mo Fei raised his hands in salute to Yi Li and turned to walk out. He had thought that coming to Jiangxia City this time would be an easy matter. After all, no matter how high her position was, she was still a woman. Everything she had was based on Prince Ding. Mo Fei did not think much of her. But he did not expect that Princess Ding would not give him the slightest chance. She did not even give him a chance to say what he wanted to say before hurriedly retreating. Yi Li stared at his retreating figure. She smiled faintly and said, "Stop him." Before she finished speaking, two figures appeared at the door, one on the left and one on the right, blocking Mo Fei's path. Mo Fei's eyes jumped. He turned to stare at Yi Li and said harshly, "Wang Fei, what is the meaning of this?" Yi Li smiled and said, "If Sir Mo wants to leave, please go ahead. As for Genom of Gojoseon, I'm afraid I will have to trouble you to stay for a while." Mo Fei's expression changed slightly. He forced a smile and said, "What, Genom of Gojoseon, is Wang Fei joking?" As soon as Yi Li's words left her mouth, everyone in the room immediately looked at the four people following Mo Fei with vigilance. The tall and burly general ignored them and locked his gaze on the three attendants. Feng Jiao, Yuan Pei and Qin Feng quickly changed their positions. Zhuojing inadvertently moved closer to Su Qingze. Yi Li smiled and stared at one of the men. She said, "His Highness Genom of Gojoseon, since you have come, why hide?" Chapter 323. A moment later, unbridled laughter sounded in the room. The tall man standing in the middle, dressed in the attire of an attendant, casually wiped his face. His ordinary appearance instantly changed. Genom of Gojoseon was in his early 50s this year. His appearance was 70 to 80% similar to Lei Tingfeng, but he had more grace and dominance. However, the way he looked at Yi Li made her feel extremely uncomfortable. As long as one was a man, they would be able to understand what that flash of light meant. Anger and killing intent flashed across the faces of Feng Jiao and the others. Yi Li was not angry. She had seen all kinds of people in her previous life. This degree was not enough for her to lose her cool. She looked indifferently at Genom of Gojoseon, who was laughing wildly and did not speak. When Genom of Gojoseon finally seemed to have finished laughing, he walked to a chair at the side and sat down. Mo Fei and the other three stood respectfully behind him. Even though he was dressed in the attire of a servant, it was difficult to conceal his domineering aura. How did Wang Fei see through it? Such good eyesight. I admire you, Genom of Gojoseon said curiously. Yili smiled. Shuijing, has this Fei ever taught you what the most important thing to do if you want to disguise yourself? Shuijing replied in a low voice, ordinary and unremarkable. Unnoticeable. Genom of Gojoseon raised an eyebrow and said, I can't think of any flaws. Shuijing looked at Genom of Gojoseon and then raised his head to look at Yili. Yili nodded slightly. Shuijing said, a person with a disability is not suited to disguise himself. Everyone's gaze immediately focused on Genom of Gojoseon's left arm. Everyone knew that Genom of Gojoseon had been defeated by Mo Lufang more than a decade ago and had only managed to survive after losing an arm. Originally, no one had paid much attention to it, but now that their attention was focused on his arm, those with good eyesight immediately noticed that something was wrong. Genom of Gojoseon had not moved his left arm. His left hand was hidden in his sleeve. Although the sleeves weren't empty, it still made people feel that they were too stiff if they took a closer look. After all, no matter what it was, even if the shape was the same, it could never replace the texture of a real arm. Genom of Gojoseon's expression hardened and the corners of his eyes twitched. Shuijing's words had touched his sore spot. Being defeated by Mo Lufang was a shadow and humiliation that he would never be able to forget. However, Mo Lufang had been dead for a long time. In the eyes of the world, he would always be left with the impression that Enchanting, the king of South guarding Shilling, was inferior to Mo Lufang. Therefore he placed more importance on how to defeat the Mahist army in Mo Xiao. Because this was the only way he could wash away his humiliation. Good, Princess Ding's subordinates are truly capable. A moment later, Genom of Gojoseon said in a deep voice. Yili nodded and smiled faintly. Prince praises me too much. Genom of Gojoseon examined Yili and asked, just now, Princess Ding did not hesitate to reject Ai's letter. Will you reconsider now? Yili held her forehead, shook her head and sighed. I cannot find a reason to reconsider. Genom of Gojoseon laughed brightly. Does Wang Fei think that I is not as good as Mo Xiao? Yili tilted her head and thought for a moment. Then she shook her head and said, how can that be? At least Prince is older than our prince. Genom of Gojoseon's eyes flashed. As expected, Wang Fei is not an ordinary woman. What if I say that as long as Wang Fei follows I will immediately withdraw my troops from Dongchu? Impudence. Yuan Pei was furious. He slapped the table and stood up, glaring angrily at Genom of Gojoseon. The expressions of the others were not good either. Yili raised a hand to stop Yuan Pei. She smiled faintly and said, for Prince to say this, does he think that Yili's brain is not good? Genom of Gojoseon raised an eyebrow and asked in confusion, why does Wang Fei say this? Yili laughed coldly and said, Shiling's army of hundreds of thousands has invaded our Dechu state and finally reached Jiangxia. It would not be easy for Prince to withdraw his troops now, right? Besides, I feel that rather than humiliating the country in exchange for Prince's withdrawal, it would be more convenient to directly exchange for Prince. Does Prince agree? Hearing this, the expressions of the Shiling's followers changed. The man who looked like a general pulled out his sword with a clang and stood in front of Genom of Gojoseon to protect him. Yili raised an eyebrow and smiled without speaking. Genom of Gojoseon raised his hand and pressed down on the weapon in his subordinate's hand. He said, everyone in this room is an expert. Princess Ding is willing to let you bring your sword in. This means that she is confident that your sword is not a threat. Put it down. That person looked at Yili with some reluctance. In the end, he obeyed Genom of Gojoseon's orders and put away the sword in his hand. Seeing that he was about to become a prisoner, Genom of Gojoseon was clearly not in a hurry. As the host, Yili was naturally not in a hurry. She sat leisurely and drank tea. After a while, Genom of Gojoseon sighed and said, even though I took a risk by coming here today, seeing Wang Fei, I feel that this trip was not in vain. What are Wang Fei's plans? Yili put down her teacup and said, I have said that the others can leave, but I invite Prince to stay for a few days. Genom of Gojoseon shook his head and said, I am busy with military affairs. I am afraid that I will have to disappoint Wang Fei's good intentions. No matter. If anything happened to him, not only would the Shilling army be leaderless, but the West Hill barracks would also be in chaos. And the Southern Marquis heir was just a Marquis heir. Even if the Southern Marquis had some prestige in the Chu capital to the Chu state army, the Southern Marquis heir who had just entered the battlefield would have less influence on the Mahist army than a captain. This kind of transaction was unbelievably easy. Both sides quickly made preparations for the exchange of hostages. The location of the exchange was set to be 3 days later in a small valley 5 miles outside of Jiangxia city. Yili only brought Qin Feng and Zhuo Jing, as well as a few specially trained soldiers under Qin Feng and a dozen shadow guard. Even though he was a prisoner, Genom of Gojoseon was still as elegant as ever. He was not in a sorry state as a hostage. When he saw Yili, he was even in a good mood and smiled at her. Yili did not pay attention to him. She waved her hand and had people take him away. Compared to Genom of Gojoseon, the Southern Marquis heir's situation was clearly much worse. The Southern Marquis heir was dragged out from behind by the West Hill people. He was covered in wounds and looked tired and dispirited. The leader of the West Hill people was actually the heir of Genom of Gojoseon, Lei Tingfeng, whom she had met several times in West Hill. It was obvious that he had rushed over from Xinyang overnight after receiving the news. Seeing Yili also sitting on a horse, he paused and said with a smile, "Wang Fei, how have you been since we last met?" Yili raised her eyebrows and said indifferently, "Not bad. I could have been very good. It's a pity that the heir and your country refused to give me this opportunity." Lei Tingfeng laughed and said, "Fighting on the battlefield is a man's business. With your status as a princess, you should be living a life of luxury. Why should you meddle in this mundane world?" Yili sighed and said, "I am a mundane person. How can I be detached from the mundane world? Erlei, let's stop chatting here. May I ask what is the current situation of the Southern Marquis heir?" Lei Tingfeng turned to look at the Southern Marquis heir who was being held behind him. He smiled apologetically at Yili and said, "Swords have no eyes on the battlefield. The Southern Marquis heir is inevitably injured. I hope Wang Fei will not blame him." Yili smiled faintly and said, "I don't blame him. I understand now. Erlei is reminding me that I am too lenient with the captive. Zhuojing." She raised her slender hand slightly and made a simple gesture. Zhuojing responded and moved like the wind. There were 2 cracking sounds and a scream came from behind. Mo Fei, who was standing beside Genom of Gojoseon, had his left arm bent strangely and drooped down. Lei Tingfeng's expression changed slightly. He stared at Yili in front of him like lightning. Yili's expression was normal. She tilted her head and looked at the surprised Genom of Gojoseon. She smiled at Lei Tingfeng and said, "Heir, I don't like to mistreat the captive. But I have always believed in an eye for an eye and a tooth for a tooth. This time I will let Zermo do it for me. If there is a chance in the future, I don't mind returning the favor to Genom of Gojoseon. Or, have the heir's injuries healed?" Lei Tingfeng was silent for a moment. He ordered the people beside him, "Send Marquis Nan's heir over." 2 soldiers helped Nan's heir over to Yili's side. Yili waved her hand and said, "For the sake of fairness, send Genom of Gojoseon over." Qin Feng nodded. The 2 people behind him, one on the left and one on the right, led Genom of Gojoseon to the opposite side. When they reached the middle, the 2 sides exchanged places. Just as the 2 hostages returned to their own sides, Lei Tingfeng's deep voice suddenly came from the opposite side. "Do it." Before his voice died away, Genom of Gojoseon quickly retreated. The 2 soldiers shot forward like arrows. One of them pounced on Nan's heir while the other pounced on Yili. At the same time, more than 10 figures beside Lei Tingfeng also pounced quickly. They were accompanied by a rain of arrows. All of this happened in the blink of an eye. The 2 Chu state soldiers standing in the middle flashed in front of Nan's heir. Before the West Hill soldier pouncing on Nan's heir could reach him, he felt a chill in his chest. He fell to the ground with an expression of disbelief. The other person did not stop the person running toward Yili. Instead, he pounced on Genom of Gojoseon, who was retreating. The soldier who had dealt with the West Hill soldier did not pay any more attention to Nan's heir. Instead, he pounced on Genom of Gojoseon with his companion not far away. After this sudden change, Nan's heir also reacted. He ignored the wounds on his body and chased after them. Genom of Gojoseon clearly did not expect that the 2 seemingly ordinary Eastern Chu soldiers beside him would have such strong skills. Moreover, their coordination was almost flawless. However, Genom of Gojoseon was one of the top experts in the world. Even though he had lost an arm, he was still a top expert. Naturally, he was not afraid of these soldiers. However, these soldiers were clearly different from the Eastern Chu soldiers that Genom of Gojosian knew. They were clearly very good at dealing with this kind of top expert. Just as they had exchanged a few moves, a few more people came forward and surrounded him. However, they did not lose their composure because of the large number of people. They still cooperated with each other as if they had practiced this thousands of times. He didn't think that Yi Li's arrangements were waiting for him to make a move. Yi Li thought for a moment and asked, "How about Shitzi lead the army out of Dechu state?" Lei Tingfeng's expression darkened slightly. He said, "Wang Fei is making things difficult for this lowly prince." Yi Li raised her eyebrows and looked somewhat helplessly at Genom of Gojosian. She said, "Prince, so a mere Xinyang city isn't even worth it. Is Shiling's Genom of Gojosian so cheap?" Genom of Gojosian smiled faintly and said, "To take Xinyang, Xiling sacrificed countless soldiers. This matter is not something my son can decide. Wang Fei is making things difficult for him." Yi Li narrowed her eyes slightly and quickly said, "All right, this consort will not make things difficult for him. 50,000 dan of grain and 5 million taels of silver." Wang Fei is speaking too carelessly. Lei Tingfeng frowned. Yi Li snorted coldly and said sternly, "Cut off Genom of Gojosian's other hand." Shuijing nodded and said, "As you command." Seeing that Shuijing had indeed pulled out his sword from the soldier behind him and was about to swing it at Genom of Gojosian, Lei Tingfeng hurriedly stopped him. "Wang Fei, please wait." Yi Li raised her eyebrows and looked at him indifferently. After a while, Lei Tingfeng finally nodded and said, "All right, it's a deal. But this lowly prince needs time. Also, Wang Fei must guarantee that father will not be harmed in any way. Otherwise, this lowly prince will slaughter all the people of East Chu wherever the army goes." Yi Li's smile became even colder. "In 5 days it will still be here. Also, Shitzi Lei had better not be joking. Otherwise, this consort does not mind killing all the generals of Xiling. For example, Jing Bian. Of course, this consort does not mind slaughtering all of Xiling." Lei Tingfeng's heart trembled. He looked deeply at Yi Li and nodded. "It's a deal." When they returned to Jiangxiao, Yi Li waved her hand and had people take Genom of Gojosian and the others away. She took Marquis Nan Shitzi to see Marquis Nan, who had been anxiously waiting. Seeing his son come back covered in injuries, Marquis Nan was pleasantly surprised and distressed. He looked his son up and down and did not forget to ask him where he was injured. Marquis Nan Shitzi probably did not expect that he would have the chance to see his parents again in this life. His eyes reddened. He broke free from Marquis Nan's hand and knelt on the ground. He said in a low voice, "This child has embarrassed father." Marquis Nan pulled him up and said tearfully, "Silly child, it's good that you're back. Why are you still talking about this? It's good that you're back." After the initial joy, Marquis Nan remembered that Yi Li and the others were still present. He quickly wiped his tears and pulled his son. "It's all thanks to Wang Fei that you can come back safely. Quickly thank Wang Fei for saving your life." Marquis Nan Shitzi stepped forward and bowed. "Many thanks to Wang Fei for saving my life." Yi Li pursed her lips and smiled. "Brother-in-law, you don't have to be so formal. We're family. Did brother-in-law do anything wrong? Did the people of Xiling hurt you?" Marquis Nan and his son looked at each other. Marquis Nan Shitzi shook his head and smiled. "It's just a small injury. Many thanks, third sister, for your concern. If you need anything in the future, just tell me. The Nan Marquis residence will definitely help you." Yi Li smiled and thanked him. She knew that even if the Nan Marquis residence could not help the Prince Ding mansion in the future, they would definitely not become the enemy of the Prince Ding mansion. This time Lei Tingfeng did not play any tricks. 5 days later, at the same time at the same place, 50,000 dan of rations and 5 million taels of silver were delivered to Yi Li. Yi Li also kept her promise and released Genom of Gojosian. Genom of Gojosian returned to Shiling's camp. He turned his head and looked deeply at Yi Li. "I was too arrogant. Wang Fei has won this round. Princess Ding, we still have a long time ahead of us." Yi Li smiled sweetly and said, "Prince is joking. How can I dare to say that I have won against Prince? I was just lucky." Genom of Gojosian's expression became slightly subservient. He turned around and left. She was neither arrogant in victory nor discouraged in defeat. Wang Fei, a woman, had easily won a large amount of rations and silver from Xiling. However, she did not show any arrogance on her face. As expected, she was not someone an ordinary woman could compare to. Yili watched as Genom of Gojoseon's figure disappeared into the Xiling army. She turned around and said to Feng Jiao, "Pass down the order, the entire army is on guard." Feng Jiao raised his eyebrows in confusion. Yili said indifferently, "After suffering such a big loss, how can Genom of Gojoseon not take revenge? Wang Fei Xinyang has been reclaimed by our army." A soldier rushed in with a face full of joy. Yili was stunned. "What did you say?" The soldier raised his head and said loudly, "News just came from the front. Prince led 100,000 troops down from the north and defeated Xiling's northern army. Last night they reclaimed Xinyang. Xiuyao is back? Prince is back." Yili and Feng Jiao looked at each other and saw the ecstasy in each other's eyes. Yili gathered her thoughts and said loudly, "Return to the city." Chapter 326. Leng Qingyu gritted his teeth and finally said firmly, "I beg Prince to accept me. I am willing to be a pawn as long as I can defeat the Xiling people. After returning to the capital, I am willing to die to atone for my sins." Mo Xiuyao looked at him indifferently and said indifferently after a while, "In that case I will fulfill your wish." After dismissing everyone, only Feng Jiao and Zhuojing were left in the study. Mo Xiuyao leaned against the couch and looked at the two of them silently, one hand tapping the armrest casually. The study was silent. After a long time his voice rang out in the study. "Feng-san, what happened in the capital after I left?" Feng Jiao naturally wouldn't hide anything for Mo Jingqi and hurriedly told him everything that had happened after Mo Xiuyao left the capital, adding fuel to the fire. Although Zhuojing always liked to have a cold face in front of others, he spared no effort in speaking ill of people who intended to harm his master. Hearing this, Mo Xiuyao's originally unpleasant expression became even gloomier. Mo Xiuyao was really angry. Not only because Mo Jingqi had set his sights on Li Li, but also because he didn't know the severity of the matter as the emperor. In Mo Xiuyao's opinion, the tens of thousands of soldiers and the lives of all the people in Xinyang were lost because of Mo Jingqi's suspicion and narrow-mindedness. Mo Xiuyao once wondered if the ancestors of the Ding royal estate were too meddlesome, which caused the emperor to be so wary of the Ding royal estate. Now he truly understood that it wasn't that the ancestors of the Ding royal estate didn't know how to overshadow their master, nor that they didn't know how to avoid the emperor's suspicion. It was that some things had to be done even though they knew they couldn't be done. "Good, very good." Mo Xiuyao laughed softly, but his deep laughter made Feng Jiao shiver for no reason. Mo Xiuyao looked up and said to the two of them, "You can go back first. This subordinate will take his leave." When Yili stepped into the study, it was already midnight. Although she had just woken up and was a little angry at Mo Xiuyao's unscrupulous behavior, she couldn't help but walk out of the room to take a look when she realized that he wasn't in the room. Seeing that the light in the study was still on, Yili knew that he must still be working in the study. After thinking about it, she couldn't bear to see him like this. She turned around and went to the kitchen to make some supper and brought it into the study. In the study, Mo Xiuyao was hunched over his desk, furiously writing. When he heard the sound at the door, he raised his head and saw the woman at the door wearing a plain cloak. Her hair was casually tied up, and she held a tray full of food in her hands as she looked at him quietly. The light shone on her beautiful face, making her inconceivably beautiful and gentle. "Once this war drags on into winter, has Li Li read the history of Xiling's wars?" Yili shook her head. In the past she didn't care about these things. After marrying Mo Xiuyao, too many things had happened. In reality, she didn't have much time to read books. Mo Xiuyao said, "If Li Li has read it, you'll know that once the Xiling army runs out of food, they will quickly attack the common people." In reality, the Xiling army has always thought of themselves as tyrannical. Xiling doesn't produce food, so their food supplies have never been sufficient. To them, the common people of the enemy country are just a backup source of food. Even though Dechu state hasn't been harmed before, the western countries and even the southern border have all had their cities massacred by Xiling. If Xiling gets their hands on Suncreed city's food, this war will drag on even longer. Once winter arrives, the food supplies will run out and more people will be harmed. Besides, even if someone is to be blamed, the first to be blamed is the people who failed to defend the city. Yili leaned into his thick embrace. Even though she knew that Emo Xiuyao was comforting her, she still felt much more relaxed. Yili wasn't one to dwell on insignificant issues, so she quickly put this matter aside. She lowered her head to look at the shocking numbers on the memorial and sighed. War was always accompanied by the loss of countless common people's innocent lives. This made one feel both heartache and helpless. The two of them huddled under the lamp and talked about various things that happened after they parted. After Emo Xiuyao heard Genom of Gojoseon's various things, his face immediately darkened. He hugged Yili and said softly, "Lili is too soft-hearted. Asking him for tens of thousands of dan of food and a few million taels of silver is too cheap for him. If it were I would just break his other hand and be done with it." Yili raised her head and looked amusedly at the strangely childish man in front of her. She said, "If that's the case, I'm afraid that we and Xiling will not rest until one of us is dead. Haven't we communicated with the Emperor of Xiling?" Emo Xiuyao shook his head and said helplessly, "I'm afraid that the Emperor of Xiling won't be of much use. Whether he can live past this year is another matter. Once the Emperor of Xiling dies, I'm afraid there will be another young emperor. The military and political power of Xiling will completely fall into the hands of Genom of Gojoseon." This time on the trip to the northern tribes, I learned that Princess Li is not only in charge of the prince's mansion, but also in the battlefield. She's also very good at training soldiers. If he hadn't seen it with his own eyes, even Emo Xiuyao would have found it hard to believe that such an army and soldiers existed in the world. It wasn't that their martial arts were very strong, nor was it that they were good at fighting. It was that they had mastered various skills on the battlefield and their accuracy was shocking. Emo Xiuyao even thought that if such an army really appeared, how terrible it would be. Yili glanced at him and said, "These training methods use too much manpower and resources, and have high demands on the soldiers themselves. Using them on the battlefield with thousands of soldiers and horses does not have much practical use. Can be said that the losses do not outweigh the gains." No one had been eliminated in this first training. But that was because these people were the best of the best, and many of them had been eliminated during the selection process. More importantly, this was the first time in this era that Yili was training the soldiers she wanted. Because many of the equipment and the fighting methods of the two eras were different, this time could only be considered an exploration. It was hard to say that these people met Yili's requirements. Emo Xiuyao did not blink and looked with a smile at Yili. "Does Princess Li have any suggestions?" Yili blinked and looked at Emo Xiuyao for a long time without saying anything. After a while she said in a low voice, "Give me some time to think." Emo Xiuyao did not care. It was fine as long as he achieved his goal. If Princess Li was not interested in these things, then he would hope that she would just be a leisurely Ding country Wang Fei. But since Princess Li was interested and had the ability, he would not block her light. After dealing with Emo Xiuyao, Yili turned to say to Qin Feng, "Starting today, you are the commander of Qi Lin. In the future these people will be given to you." Qin Feng nodded and said, "This subordinate will not betray Wang Fei's trust." Chapter 328. Yili nodded and said, "That's good. You have to spend more effort on these people. Remember, you are not a large-scale ordinary army. You don't have to participate in the fighting on the battlefield. Do you understand?" Qin Feng raised his eyebrows slightly and said, "This subordinate doesn't understand. We are not weaker than ordinary soldiers." Learning a lot of skills but not being able to charge on the battlefield was a very depressing thing. Did Wang Fei only want them to be spies to gather information? Thinking of this, Qin Feng was a little depressed. Yili raised her eyebrows and said lightly, "You are indeed not weaker than ordinary soldiers. You are even many times stronger than them. But, if you 50 people were to mix into an army, can you fight against 100? Qin Feng was speechless. In a chaotic army, swords had no eyes. It was not as easy to determine the strength of a person as it was in a martial arts competition. Sometimes luck was just as important. If you were alive, you would be strong. No matter how high your martial arts were, no matter how agile you were, you would still become like a hedgehog if you were hit by a barrage of arrows. Yili looked at him and said, "You cannot fight against 100, but the cost of training each of you is 100 times that of ordinary soldiers. Therefore the battlefield you will face will be different from theirs. Maybe it will not be as grand as a battlefield, but it will be more shocking. Small-scale, high-intensity battles are what you need to do. Earlier I said that tracking, hiding, scouting behind enemy lines, rescuing hostages, attacking and destroying, stealing information, kidnapping, assassination, etc. You must do everything that ordinary soldiers cannot do. These are what you need to do. Do you understand? Qin Feng thought for a moment and nodded. This subordinate understands. It's good that you understand. After returning to the capital, immediately begin the second special training. I will give you the training methods and subjects later. This time you will be in charge. My request is that within 5 years, the number of people in Qilin must reach 1,000. Qin Feng was overjoyed. Although his subordinates were all elites, only 50 people looked a little shabby. Qin Feng imagined himself leading an elite team of over 1,000 people. That feeling was definitely not much worse than leading an army of thousands of people. He hurriedly said in a clear voice, "Subordinate obeys, I guarantee to complete the mission. Very well, you may leave." After dismissing Qin Feng and Lin Han, Mo Xiaoyao smiled and looked at Yi Li, who was in high spirits, and said, "I now understand why Li looked down on the shadow guard of the Ding King's palace. Compared to Li Li's people, the shadow guard was far inferior. I'm starting to look forward to the day that Yi Li said that this team will be formed." Yi Li looked at him and said, "Your Highness, don't speak nonsense. I've never looked down on the shadow guards. There were many people in the shadow guard with extraordinary abilities. At most, she just felt that it was a waste of talent for the Prince Ding mansion to use people like this." Mo Xiaoyao lowered his eyebrows and thought for a moment before saying, "Since Li Li intends to increase the number of people in Qilin, after returning to the capital, let all the shadow guard participate in Qilin's special training. In the future, the Ding King's palace will cancel the shadow guard system." Is this good? Yi Li was also worried about Mo Xiaoyao's quick decision, especially when she thought of a certain eccentric shadow guard commander. After knowing Mo Xiaoyao's decision, Mo Hua probably had the heart to eat her. Mo Xiaoyao smiled and played with her hair. "What's not good about it? Since there's a more advantageous method, why not use it?" Yi Li said, "Isn't the shadow guard specially used to protect the master of the Prince Ding mansion?" Mo Xiaoyao smiled and said, "Didn't you also say that Qilin's mission also included protection? And this time they did very well in the northern tribes. It was indeed very good. The people trained by Yi Li could fight and kill, speak eloquently, act dumb, disguise themselves, use poison and gather information." Yi Li was a little speechless as she looked at him. So this was his plan. Prince really knows how to scheme. Yi Li glanced at him unhappily. In Mo Xiaoyao's eyes, this look was coquettish and flirtatious. His heart moved as he reached out to pull her into his arms and leaned over to kiss her. Their lips and tongues intertwined. Yi Li was kissed until she almost couldn't breathe. Mo Xiaoyao's large palms made her beautiful face turn red and her body go limp. Ever since he returned from the northern tribes, Mo Xiaoyao had obviously changed a lot compared to the past. These changes made Yi Li happy, but occasionally she couldn't bear it. "Bastard Mo Xiaoyao, will you die if you don't go into heat?" Mo Xiaoyao chuckled. His cool lips moved around her slender neck and his warm breath made Yi Li's face turn even redder. "Bastard Mo Xiaoyao." Yi Li's clear eyes narrowed. She raised her hand and wanted to hit him. Mo Xiaoyao seemed to have expected this move. He raised his hand and gently caressed it. "Yi Li, don't you feel hurt if you hit me?" Yi Li rolled her eyes. She raised her head and touched Mo Xiaoyao's forehead. Mo Xiaoyao looked at her and raised his eyebrows in confusion. Yi Li calmly said, "You don't have a fever. You're dreaming in the middle of the day." Mo Xiaoyao was stunned when he heard this. He leaned on Yi Li's shoulder and laughed. After a while he raised his head and said gently, "Yi Li is so cruel. Even if Yi Li doesn't care about me, your husband will worry about Yi Li's hand hurting." Yi Li was powerless. She was not used to Mo Xiaoyao's sudden mushy behavior. Chapter 329. Never leave or abandon. Mo Xiaoyao murmured softly. He liked this phrase. The thought of never leaving Li made him happy from the bottom of his heart. Anyone who dared to stand in their way, he would make them pay the price. Shilin Camp. The atmosphere in the tent was gloomy and chilly. Genom of Gojoseon's expression was the ugliest it had ever been since Shilin sent out its troops. Ever since Mo Xiaoyao suddenly appeared to seize Xinjiang, the entire army of Dechu State seemed to have suddenly come alive. In the short span of 10 days, the results of nearly a month's worth of battles seemed to have disappeared. Not only had the northern army been defeated by Mo Xuyao's surprise attack, the southern army had also met with setbacks. Only the south vanquishing king personally oversaw the central army, which was relatively stable. But how difficult would it be to take back Suncreed City from Mo Xuyao's hands again? Why did they have to lose 50,000 dan of rations and millions of taels of silver to Princess Ding? This made the Xiling army, which was already lacking in rations, even worse in the coming winter. Prince, please calm down, the generals said with some trepidation. Genom of Gojoseon snorted coldly and said, calm down, calm down. Do you not know how to say anything other than calm down? Knowing that the prince was in a fit of anger, the generals did not dare to speak. They could only look at Lei Tingfeng, who was sitting to the side, pleading for help. Lei Tingfeng smiled faintly. He stood up and said to Genom of Gojoseon, Father, we all know that Mo Xuyao is not easy to deal with. Father, please don't make things difficult for them. They have already done their best. Genom of Gojoseon snorted softly. He swept a cold glance over everyone and said, go back. If you are flustered by the Mahist army again tomorrow, you may as well take off your armor and become pawns. Everyone agreed and looked gratefully at Lei Tingfeng before leaving the tent dejectedly. Only Genom of Gojoseon and his son were left in the tent. There were no outsiders. Lei Tingfeng smiled and said, Father, we cannot rush to deal with Mo Xuyao. Even though we have suffered some losses these few days, we are not at a disadvantage in the current situation. Genom of Gojoseon sighed softly and said, I do not know this. But, Tingfeng, do not underestimate Mo Xuyao. In I's opinion, Mo Xuyao is even more dangerous than Mo Lufang. Lei Tingfeng raised his eyebrows in surprise. He did not think that his father would have such a high opinion of Mo Xuyao, whom he had only met a few times. Mo Lufang was Mo Xuyao's father. His father's greatest enemy in this life could also be said to be his only enemy. As expected, the student has surpassed the master? If Mo Xuyao had been living peacefully these few years, I might not have valued him so much. But you also know what kind of life he has been living these few years, and what kind of injuries he suffered back then. But look at the performance of the Mahist army these few days. Mo Xuyao is not unfamiliar at all. He is even more experienced than the legends say. This means that even if Mo Xuyao was sick and did not leave the Ding King's residence, he still has the ability to completely control the Mahist army. Furthermore, the Mahist army is still wholeheartedly convinced by him. Tingfeng, are you able to do it? Genom of Gojoseon lightly asked. Lei Tingfeng slightly frowned and thought for a moment. Then he raised his head and his expression was somewhat serious. His smile carried some shame and unwillingness, but he still shook his head and said, Your son is useless. I cannot do it. No one knew better than him how badly Mo Xuyao had been injured back then. He knew that under that kind of situation he would definitely not be able to control the Mahist army as perfectly as Mo Xuyao. It was even possible that he would have been defeated by that kind of pain and torture, or become crazy from being swallowed by hatred. Genom of Gojoseon nodded and said with some relief, It is a good thing to be able to clearly see your own shortcomings. Mo Lufang gave birth to a good son and also a good wife. He really has a good life. Lei Tingfeng thought about the day of the exchange of hostages, the woman in white who was talking and laughing calmly. He could not help but admit that Mo Xuyao was indeed very lucky. Marrying such a woman as his wife, how many heroes in the world would envy Mo Xuyao to death? What plans does father have? Lei Tingfeng asked. Genom of Gojoseon raised his eyebrows and said, What plans do you think father has? Lei Tingfeng smiled and said, Although father looked very angry on the surface, he was not truly angry. This means that father already has a plan in his heart. If father was truly angry, not to mention him pleading for leniency, even if the heavenly emperor came, it would be useless. Genom of Gojoseon casually played with the jade thumb ring on his hand and said with a cold smile, That year, Mo Xuyao was lucky and the Ding royal estate was not destined to be destroyed. I want to see if he is still so lucky. Lei Tingfeng's heart moved and his expression changed slightly. Father, you plan to? Genom of Gojoseon leisurely smiled and said, The Ding royal estate is not only an eyesore to I. Prince is right. The Ding royal estate is indeed an eyesore to many people. In this world there are many people who want it to disappear. A gentle voice came from outside the tent. Lei Tingfeng frowned when he heard this and a trace of disgust flashed across his face. Jenim of Gojoseon saw this and shook his head in amusement. The curtain of the large tent was lifted from the outside and a slender and graceful figure walked in. Chapter 330. Jenim of Gojoseon looked at her with a smile that wasn't a smile. Since Long-er came here in such a hurry, I presume you already know that Imo Xiuyao is in Suncreed City? Suzuki was slightly startled. Something flashed through her eyes, but it was quickly concealed by a charming smile. She lightly glanced at Jenim of Gojoseon and said, Long-er did know that Imo Xiuyao was in Suncreed City, but when I found out Long-er was already halfway there. Could it be that I couldn't have come here because I missed Prince? As expected, Prince still doesn't want to see Long-er. Jenim of Gojoseon leisurely admired the peerless beauty's coquettish expression in front of him. With a faint smile, he reached out and pulled her into his embrace, laughing loudly as he said, How could I not miss Long-er? Your Highness. The beauty softly clung onto the Zhenan Wang's body as if she was boneless and called out in a sweet voice. Lei Tingfeng looked at the scene in front of him with an ugly expression. In the end he couldn't help but coldly say, Father, if there's nothing else, this son will take his leave first. Jenim of Gojoseon let go of Suzuki. He looked at Lei Tingfeng and shook his head as he said, Child, you're good at everything but you're just too serious about everything. The usual smile on Lei Tingfeng's face vanished without a trace. He cast a glance at Suzuki and said, Son, there's no need to be serious about a promiscuous woman. It's just that I find her disgusting. Lei Tingfeng, you're going too far. Suzuki was so angry that her face alternated between red and white. She turned to Jenim of Gojoseon, her eyes red with grievance as she said unwillingly, Prince, look at His Highness, he actually said that about me. Long-er really doesn't have the face to live anymore. That's enough, you two don't quarrel every time you see each other. Jenim of Gojoseon put away the smile on his face and said with a frown. Suzuki snorted softly and glared at Lei Tingfeng, but for some reason she held back. Lei Tingfeng said, If there's nothing else, your son will leave first. Jenim of Gojoseon shook his head and said, Forget it, let's talk business. Long-er, what plans do you have for Imo Xiuyao? Suzuki's beautiful brows furrowed slightly, but she quickly raised her head and said with a charming smile, Does the prince want Long-er to go back and look for him? Jenim of Gojoseon smiled and said, Go back and look for him? Do you think he will still accept you now? Who in the world doesn't know that the Prince of Dingwa is deeply in love with Wang Fei? A trace of resentment flashed across Suzuki's eyes. She raised her head, but her eyes were still as charming as before. She said softly, Prince, do you not believe me? Long-er and Prince Ding grew up together. Could it be that I can't compare to Yili, that useless daughter? That Yili, other than having a good family background, what else does she have? No, she doesn't even have a good family background, she just has a good grandfather. It's a pity that Master Qingyun hasn't paid attention to worldly affairs for many years. She is Prince Ding's legitimate fiancée, De Chu states, #1 beauty in the world. Could it be that she can't compare to a woman with no talent and no looks? Lei Tingfeng snorted disdainfully, clearly expressing his meaning. Suzuki glared angrily at him. Jenim of Gojoseon smiled and said, How could that be? I absolutely believe that Long-er is a peerless beauty in the world. How could Imo Xiuyao not be defeated and fall under Long-er's skirt? Suzuki smiled at Lei Tingfeng with a bit of pride. What does the prince want me to do? Jenim of Gojoseon smiled and didn't say anything. Father, will Imo Xiuyao take the bait? After Suzuki left the tent, Lei Tingfeng frowned and asked. Jenim of Gojoseon looked at him and asked, Do you think I will be infatuated with her? Lei Tingfeng shook his head. He naturally saw clearly that although his father had some connection with Suzuki, he definitely didn't have any true feelings for her. Jenim of Gojoseon smiled and said, Since I won't take the bait, then why would Imo Xiuyao? Then father, isn't it too childish to let her seduce Imo Xiuyao? If that woman had the ability to seduce Imo Xiuyao, why would she appear in the Western Tomb? Jenim of Gojoseon smiled and said, Who said that I want her to seduce Imo Xiuyao? With such a wonderful person like the princess consort of Dingwa, Bai Long is just a pretty but useless face. Lei Tingfeng frowned but quickly relaxed and looked up at Jenim of Gojoseon and said, Father has other plans. I just want her to distract Imo Xiuyao's attention for I. If she can't even do this well, then she's useless. Jenim of Gojoseon smiled coldly, his voice cold and emotionless. There was no trace of the gentleness and love from before. In Xinyang City, Yili sat leisurely beside Emo Xiuyao, looking at a secret letter she had just received and raised her eyebrows with interest. Emo Xiuyao looked up and happened to see her interested expression. He couldn't help but ask curiously, "Is there any interesting news?" Yili passed the secret letter to him and said, "There's a nobleman from the Emperor of Shiling's palace. I'm afraid that he has already arrived at the West Hill barracks in 2 days." Emo Xiuyao frowned slightly. A nobleman from the palace? In the West Hill Palace, other than the Emperor of Shiling, the only noblemen who could be called noblemen were the concubines and princesses. After thinking for a moment, Emo Xiuyao asked, "By long?" "Prince is wise." Yili was not stingy with her praise. Emo Xiuyao lowered his head and read the letter in his hand. He looked up at Yili and said, "I didn't know that Mr. Li had such a talent in the West Hill. It's not easy to find out news about the West Hill now. Ever since Han Mingyue went to the West Hill, the Prince Ding mansion could clearly feel that the Shadow Guard's actions in the West Hill were restricted everywhere. After all, Han Mingyue specialized in intelligence and had a good understanding of the Prince Ding mansion. Is an heir in the West Hill now?" Yili nodded and said, "Among Zhuo Jing and the others, an heir is the most suitable for intelligence. Su Zue." The news of Bai Long coming to the Dechu state was extremely secretive. He could find out in time, which means that the intelligence network in the West Hill has already achieved some success. But Yili couldn't help but frown when she thought of something. Her original intention of sending an heir to the West Hill was not to establish an intelligence network in the West Hill, but for the Biluo flower and the flaming lotus. Unfortunately, there was no news of the Biluo flower until now. As for the flaming lotus, she had to wait until June or July next year. Emo Xiuyao only needed to think for a moment to understand Yili's original intention of sending an heir to the West Hill. He patted the back of Yili's hand comfortingly and said softly, "Don't worry, I'll be fine." Yili smiled and nodded. It was useless to worry about a problem that couldn't be solved in a short time. Yili's lips curled into a strange smile. "Prince, do you think we'll be able to see the elegance of the first beauty this time?" Emo Xiuyao smiled somewhat helplessly. He raised his eyebrows and asked, "So what if we see it? So what if we don't see it?" Yili smiled and said, "Won't Prince have tender feelings for the fairer sex?" Emo Xiuyao looked at her with a smile, his eyes filled with endless tenderness and love. "In your husband's eyes in this world, only my wife is a fragrant and beautiful jade." Yili couldn't help but twitch the corner of her mouth, throwing the free sweet words to the side. Because they had received the news earlier when they finally met, they naturally wouldn't be as excited, happy, or angry as some people had imagined. Yili and Emo Xiuyao sat calmly in the flower pavilion, looking at the beautiful woman who had just been brought in. It had to be said that there was still a certain difference between the portrait and the real person. Even though Yili felt that the original portrait was beautiful enough, the woman in front of her was even more charming and moving than the beautiful woman in the portrait. Curling the corner of her lips slightly, Yili turned her head to look at Emo Xiuyao sitting next to her. As if their hearts were connected, Emo Xiuyao also turned his head to give her a faint smile. Yili twitched the corner of her mouth and turned her head. Chapter 331. In the hall, Suzuki looked at the two arrogant people on the seats, feeling very angry. Meeting with Emo Xiuyao again, she had imagined many scenarios. It could be joy or it could be anger and ridicule, but she never thought that Emo Xiuyao would turn a blind eye to her. For a stunning beauty, this was definitely a great humiliation. "Xiuyao." Suppressing the anger in her heart, Suzuki called out softly. Her limpid eyes were filled with tears as she looked at the two people pitifully. There was also a hint of hidden bitterness in her eyes, as if tears would fall at any time. Even Yili couldn't help but praise her good acting skills in her heart. But this Suzuki was someone who had known Emo Xiuyao since he was young. Could it be that she didn't know anything about the Ding Prince's residence? She actually thought that this kind of meeting would cause some kind of impact on Emo Xiuyao? As a result, this kind of situation appeared. A rare beauty in the world stood in front of the hall in grief, as if looking at a heartless man, and looked at the Ding Prince who was calmly drinking tea in the hall. In addition, Yili was sitting on the side watching the play. If an outsider came in, they would mistakenly think that this was a play where a heartless man was fooling around with a beauty outside and abandoned her. Thinking of this, Yili couldn't help but laugh. Emo Xiaoyao and Su Zuidi turned to look at her at the same time. Yili coughed lightly and sat up straight, trying to make herself appear warm and hospitable. This? Imperial concubine Bai, you are a guest from afar, please sit. The words Imperial concubine Bai made Su Zuidi's expression slightly change. She withdrew the gaze that was originally directed at Emo Xiaoyao and looked at Yili, softly saying, "Is this the Ding Prince's concubine?" Yili couldn't help but rub the goosebumps on her arms. What did this gaze mean, as if she had let her down? Without waiting for Yili to speak, Su Zuidi had already stepped forward and bowed slightly to Yili. "Prince's concubine has worked hard to take care of Xiaoyao. Zuidi thanks you." This time Yili finally couldn't remain calm. She thought that this Su Zuidi was a devastatingly beautiful woman. Although she believed in Emo Xiaoyao's feelings for her from the bottom of her heart, she was still more or less a little worried. But what's going on now? This Su Zuidi actually has a problem in her brain? Since Zuidi, Princess Su Zuidi, why would she, as an outsider, thank her for taking care of her? She glanced at Emo Xiaoyao unhappily. "What's with your ex-fiancé? Is there something wrong with her brain?" Emo Xiaoyao smiled at her indifferently. "How would this prince know? We haven't seen each other for many years. You weren't like this in the past. Really, Lord Father's taste isn't that bad." Lightly coughing, Yili lowered her head and took a sip of tea. Only then did she adjust the expression on her face and gently smile at Su Zuidi. Imperial concubine Bai's words are too serious. This concubine and the prince are husband and wife. Taking care of him is this concubine's duty. What's more, this concubine is young and doesn't know any better. Usually it's the prince who takes care of this concubine more. There's no need to thank Imperial concubine Bai, right? The smile on Su Zuidi's face froze. She raised her head and saw Yili's expression that wasn't a smile. She suddenly remembered Genom of Gojoseon's warning. The Ding Prince's concubine isn't an easy person to deal with. If you look down on her, you'll only bring yourself big trouble. The Princess Ding in front of her was inferior to her in terms of appearance, temperament, and talent, but she was able to receive such praise from Genom of Gojoseon. This caused Su Zuidi to instinctively feel a sense of dissatisfaction and hostility. So from the beginning she deliberately ignored Yili. When she realized that Emo Xiaoyao wouldn't pay attention to her, she turned her attention to Yili. However, a mere exchange of 2 sentences had rendered her speechless. "Xiaoyao, how have you been these years?" Realizing that the Ding Prince's concubine wasn't as easy to deal with as she thought, Su Zuidi turned her gaze back to Emo Xiaoyao. Emo Xiaoyao slightly frowned and calmly drank his tea. "Not bad. Why are you here?" Su Zuidi gently bit her cherry lips, her watery eyes slightly red as she looked at him with grievance. Do you still hate me? I know you blame me. There were many times when I wanted to come back to see you and beg for your forgiveness. But I didn't dare." Sob. Before she finished speaking, pearl-like tears had already fallen. What a beautiful scene of weeping pear blossoms. It made one's heart sway uncontrollably. Unfortunately, the 2 people present weren't ordinary people. Yili resisted the itch in her throat and said, "Imperial concubine Bai, our prince wants to ask you, why are you here?" I snuck out. Su Zuidi quickly glanced at Emo Xiaoyao, a trace of red appearing on her beautiful face. "I know that Xiling and the Dechu state are at war, and I also know that you Xiaoyao will definitely appear here. No matter what. I'm still a citizen of the Dechu state, I can't go back. If I'm caught, the Emperor and Genom of Gojoseon will definitely not let me go. Xiao, I beg you, don't drive me away." Yili silently looked at the sky. She understood this Su Zuidi wanted to play them like fools. Yili faintly raised her eyebrows. Since Su Zuidi liked to play, there was no harm in playing with her. Imperial concubine Bai, is young Master Mingyu in Xiling? Su Zuidi glanced at her, originally not wanting to answer. But she saw that Emo Xiaoyao was also looking at her at the same time, so she could only say softly, "I haven't seen young Master Han in a long time." Yili said, "Speaking of which, Han Mingyue betrayed the country and defected to the enemy. His crime deserves death. But this person is too cunning, this imperial concubine, and the prince can't find him for a while. I wonder if Imperial concubine Bai can ask him to make a trip back to the Dechu state?" Su Zuidi looked at Yili with some displeasure and frowned. "I don't know where he is, I haven't seen him in a long time. Really Xiaoyao, I won't lie to you." Emo Xiaoyao had no reaction to this. Yili said with a smile. It doesn't matter if you don't know, as long as Imperial Concubine Bai is here. There's no need to worry that young Master Mingyu won't come. Prince, don't you think so? Mo Shuyao nodded. What Li said is very true. I just so happen to have a debt to settle with Han Mingyue. Imperial Concubine Bai will be handed over to Li Li. Hearing this, Su Zuidi was clearly deeply hurt. She clutched her chest and looked at Mo Shuyao in grief. Shuyao, you really still hate me? You want to use me to catch young Master Han? Yi Li leisurely admired her slender fingers, while smiling at Su Zuidi. Didn't Imperial Concubine Bai come here to beg our prince's forgiveness? Su Zuidi hesitated for a moment but still nodded. Yi Li cheerfully clapped her hands and said, That's great, as long as Imperial Concubine Bai helps us catch young Master Mingyu, our prince will definitely believe in Imperial Concubine Bai's sincerity. Prince, don't you think so? Mo Shuyao looked at Yi Li with a gentle gaze, softly saying, Li Li is right. Obviously, such a gentle Mo Shuyao made the hangover even harder to accept. Su Zuidi stared blankly at the two people in front of her, momentarily speechless. Yi Li didn't give her a chance to refuse and said with a smile, So Imperial Concubine Bai has agreed, that's great. Since that's the case, Imperial Concubine Bai can stay here with peace of mind. As long as you live in Suncrete City, this concubine guarantees that no matter if it's the Emperor Xiling or Genom King Gojoseon, not a single person will be able to touch Imperial Concubine Bai. Of course, it was even more impossible to pass on any information. Chapter 332. Su Zuidi was only startled for a moment. This matter was decided in the midst of Yi Li's laughter and she couldn't refute it. Having achieved her goal, Yi Li was in a good mood. She called for someone to take Su Zuidi away to rest, and ordered people to ensure the safety of Imperial Concubine Bai. Seeing Su Zuidi leave unwillingly, the smile on Yi Li's face gradually faded. She frowned and said, What does Genom of Gojoseon want? Su Zuidi might be good at acting, but she definitely couldn't fool Mo Shuyao who knew her background. If she wanted to be a spy in Suncrete City, Su Zuidi clearly didn't qualify. Yi Li definitely had hundreds of ways to make her unable to pass even half a word to anyone. Mo Shuyao's face also darkened. Xiling Genom of Gojoseon definitely wouldn't use such a method that he knows is useless. Li, order people to pay attention to the movements in the Xiling barracks. Yi Li nodded. You're saying that Su Zuidi is just a chess piece to distract us, and that Genom of Gojoseon has other plans? Mo Shuyao nodded. If he wanted to spy Genom of Gojoseon, he wouldn't choose Su Zuidi. She was too eye-catching. If he wanted to use Su Zuidi to set up a honey trap, he would be at a disadvantage. I understand. I will send people to pay attention to the Xiling barracks and Genom of Gojoseon's movements. The governor's office in Suncrete City was the temporary headquarters of the Mahist army. All the main generals of the Mahist army, including Yi Li and Mo Shuyao, were temporarily staying here. After that bloody massacre, Suncrete City, which originally had a population of several 100,000, had been reduced to less than a tenth. It could be said that almost all of Suncrete City were soldiers, and had entered into a militarized management. There were no pedestrians coming and going on the wide streets, no enthusiastic hawkers, only orderly and solemn soldiers. Even if some commoners passed by occasionally, their faces would be filled with sadness and stupefaction. Yi Li and Mo Shuyao walked along Suncrete City's largest street, Black Tortoise Street. Looking at the empty streets, they couldn't help but sigh. Mo Shuyao lowered his head and saw her sad expression. He silently reached out and held her hand. Yi Li raised her head and smiled at him. I'm fine. It's just that when I saw the #1 city in the northwest become empty, I suddenly felt a little disappointed. Mo Shuyao said softly, When this war is over, this place will prosper again in a few years. Yi Li shook her head and said, No matter how prosperous it is, those people are not the people who originally lived in this city. Mo Shuyao's eyes dimmed. When it comes to war, it's inevitable that ordinary people will be injured and killed. That's right. A general's success is built on the bones of 10,000. Yi Li sighed softly. A general's success is built on the bones of 10,000. Mo Shuyao was deep in thought. The Mo family's ancestors had outstanding military exploits that shocked the world. Wasn't the fame of the Mahist army also built on the blood and flesh of tens of thousands of people? The Ding Palace had always boasted of protecting the peace of the people of Dechu state. But when had he, including himself, ever truly felt sorry for the innocent people who had died in the war? Yili walked in front and looked back at Emo Shuyao with a faint smile. Her eyes held a nostalgia that he had never seen before. She slowly said, "Do you know? Someone once told me that a soldier's duty is to protect the country and the peace of the people. And the greatest shame of a soldier is to let the people they protect experience the most real war in front of their homes." Emo Shuyao was silent. The nostalgic expression of the Li in front of him made him feel that it was ethereal and distant. But it was so beautiful that it made him feel a faint pain in his heart. He suddenly felt that his heart was flustered and wanted to grab the person in front of him. It was as if he didn't do so, she would disappear in the next moment. Thus, he followed his heart and stretched out his hand to pull her into his embrace. His handsome chin supported the top of her head as he said in a deep voice, "This matter is indeed the shame of the Mahist army." Yili laughed softly and shook her head saying, "That's not what I meant. Just treat it as me speaking nonsense. This matter is not your fault." Emo Shuyao gently said, "It's even more not your fault. Lily, you've already done your best." Yili nodded. Just as she was about to stand up and leave Emo Shuyao's embrace, a pleasant voice filled with surprise and faint resentment came from behind. "Shuyao, you're here?" The two turned their heads and saw the beautiful woman standing not too far away looking at Emo Shuyao with a face full of joy. Yili sighed in her heart. Su Zuidi was not only a beautiful woman, she was also a woman who knew how to use her advantages. Xinyang City was desolate. As a guest, she was clearly not liked by the prince and the princess. Naturally, no one would specially prepare beautiful clothes and accessories for her. But looking at the woman in front of her, she was only wearing the most ordinary white clothes, but it made her look like a fairy from the ninth heaven who had descended to the mortal world. Her black hair was casually draped over her shoulders, only loosely tied with a white ribbon. Su Zuidi was already 25 years old this year, but at this time standing gracefully in the middle of the street, she looked only 2 years older than Yili, who was only 15 or 16 years old. "What are you doing here?" Emo Shuyao slightly frowned, looking at her with an indifferent expression. Su Zuidi's hands in her sleeves were tightly clenched. She shook her lips and looked at Emo Shuyao with grief in her voice. "You don't want to see me?" Emo Shuyao's expression did not change. His gaze was sharp as he stared at her and said in a low voice, "I ask you, what are you doing here?" Su Zuidi was startled. She gave a bitter laugh and looked at him with grief, saying, "I know you still hate me. You still blame me for leaving you behind that year, right? But I was also forced to do so. Why can't you forgive me? You're still guarding against me like I'm an enemy. Can't I even come out to take a breather? If you hate me so much, why don't you just kill me?" Emo Shuyao frowned, no longer paying attention to Su Zuidi. He said to the empty street, "Men." 2 figures quickly appeared at the corner of the street, respectfully waiting for orders. Emo Shuyao pointed at Su Zuidi, who was covering her face and crying, and said coldly, "Take her back. If I see her come out again, you can go receive your punishment yourselves." "This subordinate obeys," the two said in unison. Su Zuidi looked at Emo Shuyao in shock and said with a face full of disbelief, "You want to put me under house arrest? Shuyao, you're so ruthless. My grandfather will not allow you to treat me like this." Emo Shuyao said indifferently, "You want to let Elder Su know that you're still alive?" Su Zuidi was suddenly speechless. With her grandfather's temper, if he knew what she had done all these years, he would definitely kill her. She glanced at Emo Shuyao and Yili, who were still holding hands. Although Su Zuidi was unwilling, she couldn't follow the shadow guard back. If she was forcefully escorted back, it would be even more humiliating. Yili smiled at the resentful look Su Zuidi gave her before she left and shrugged indifferently. No matter how beautiful a person is, you'll get used to it after seeing it too much. She had always thought that a true beauty should be just beautiful. Being too beautiful, sometimes it's also a flaw. She accompanied Emo Shuyao to walk around the city to check on the various defenses. After comforting the lucky survivors in the city, the two returned to the governor's residence. As soon as they entered, Emo Shuyao was asked to leave by Feng Jiao. Yili also returned to the study to deal with the matters she needed to deal with. Chapter 333. Zhuojing and Lin Han had already put all kinds of information files and booklets on the desk. Seeing Yili come in, Lin Han and Zhuojing, who were still busy, quickly got up and bowed. Yili waved her hand to indicate that they didn't need to bow. The two of them then sat down and focused on the files in their hands. After 2 months of teaching, Zhuojing and Lin Han could basically meet Yili's requirements for the position of assistant. This was especially true for Zhuojing. As he had spent more time by Yili's side than Lin Han, he could understand Yili's intentions better. Most of the time Zhuojing did not need to speak. Just by raising his hand he could understand what she wanted. This freed Yili from her busy work every day. She only needed to pay attention to some of the more important matters that required her to make decisions. Is there any news from an heir? Yili sat down and asked as she picked up the booklets in her hands that needed to be dealt with. Lin Han got up and presented a booklet saying, "This was received as soon as possible. An heir had someone send it back quickly." Yili took it and opened it. The booklet was densely filled with words. The contents were all related to Su Zuidi. It included Su Zuidi's current status in the West Hill, as well as the situation of the West Hill by family behind her. There were also many things about Su Zuidi in the palace, as well as her relationship with the Emperor of Xiling and the concubines and princesses in the palace. Yili was amazed when she saw the back. She didn't expect that Su Zuidi was not only the Emperor of Xiling's favorite concubine, but also said that she had a very ambiguous relationship with Genom of Gojoseon. Su Zuidi's relationship with the Emperor of Xiling's by family was very bad. She had almost been killed by the White Queen several times. It was all thanks to Genom of Gojoseon that the danger was averted. After that, Genom of Gojoseon directly suppressed the White Empress. Now the White Empress was more like a puppet in the Xiling palace. In the palace of the Emperor of Xiling, Su Zuidi had the final say. Yili was a little puzzled. Why would Su Zuidi, who could be said to have absolute power in the harem, come all the way back to the Dechu state? Wasn't she afraid that Emo Xiuyao would still hold a grudge against her for what happened all those years ago? Or was it because she was too confident in her looks that Emo Xiuyao would fall at her feet? After reading Su Zuidi's life story, which was more like an unofficial legend, Yili pursed her lips in boredom and said, "I'll send it to Prince when I have time later." Lin Han nodded. He put the booklet aside and prepared to send it to Prince after he was done with his work. Zuidi requests to see 3rd Miss Yi. Su Zuidi's soft voice came from outside the door. Yili frowned and thought for a while before saying, "Concubine Bai, please come in." Outside the door, Su Zuidi glanced angrily at the 2 guards at the door. She raised her eyebrows and said, "Can I go in now?" Unfortunately, the beauty's angry and charming appearance was like a stone puppet in the eyes of the 2 loyal guards. They said respectfully, "The princess invites concubine Bai in." Being addressed as noble consort Bai made her feel both angry and embarrassed. Everyone in the Mahist army knew that she was Emo Xiuyao's fiancée, but the people around Emo Xiuyao and Yili all called her concubine Bai. She couldn't help but wonder if they were deliberately mocking her. In fact, Su Zuidi thought too much. Most people in the Mahist army knew that Prince's former fiancée was the #1 beauty in the world, Su Zuidi, but they also knew that Su Zuidi was already dead. Even if she called herself Su Zuidi, as long as Prince didn't admit it, it wasn't true in the eyes of these people. Moreover, both the prince and the princess called her concubine Bai, so the subordinates naturally had to follow suit. With a soft snort, Su Zuidi stepped into the study. As soon as she entered the study, she saw Yili sitting behind the desk and looking at the booklet in her hand. Not far from the other side of the study, 2 tables were put together and were also piled with all kinds of books, booklets and files. Lin Han and Zhuojing sat at the table, busy with the things in their hands. They didn't even look at the #1 beauty. It wasn't that they didn't like to look at the beauty, but this beauty kept bumping into Prince from time to time these days. Coincidentally, the prince was with the princess most of the time and they were also with the princess most of the time. So it was inevitable that they saw the beauty more often. The world liked beauties because they were unattainable. If this beauty kept sticking to you and pestering you no matter how beautiful the beauty was, it was inevitable that she would lose some of her luster. Looking at Yi Li's busy appearance, Su Zuidi's unwillingness grew even more. When she was still by Emo Xiuyao's side, not to mention helping with the affairs, Emo Xiuyao didn't even allow her to enter the study. But now Yi Li was sitting in Emo Xiuyao's seat and handling the affairs of the Ding King's residence. The thing that she didn't get before was obtained by someone who was inferior to her. How could Su Zuidi be reconciled with such a gap? Miss Yi. Su Zuidi looked at the young woman who was still busy with her own affairs in an orderly manner and frowned unhappily. Don't you know how to treat guests at all? Yi Li raised her head and glanced at her, softly saying, there are many Miss Yi in this world, but there is only one Princess Ding. If Imperial Concubine Bai knows how to treat guests, this consort will naturally know how to treat guests. Imperial Concubine Bai, please take a seat and serve tea. Su Zuidi bit her cherry lips and confirmed that Yi Li really didn't put her in her eyes at all. She snorted softly and turned to sit down at the side. Not long after, someone brought tea and placed it in front of Su Zuidi before silently taking his leave. Yi Li wrote the last word on the booklet in her hand before putting down the brush and looking up at Su Zuidi. Imperial Concubine Bai, do you have something to discuss with this consort? Su Zuidi looked at Zhuojing and Lin Han who were sitting at the side and said, Zuidi has something to discuss with the princess in private. Yi Li pursed her lips and smiled, there's no need to be like this. The two of them are not only this consort's right-hand men, they are also loyal to the Ding Palace and the prince. No matter what Imperial Concubine Bai wants to say, there's no need to avoid them. Su Zuidi was very angry at Yi Li's stubbornness, but there was nothing she could do. Because Yi Li was obviously not interested in what she wanted to say. Helpless, Su Zuidi could only stare at Yi Li and say, does the princess not want to know my identity? Yi Li raised her eyebrows and smiled slightly at Lin Han. Lin Han, let Imperial Concubine Bai see the booklet just now. Lin Han responded and got up to deliver the booklet to Su Zuidi. Su Zuidi looked at Yi Li strangely before flipping open the booklet in her hand. The more she read, the paler her face became. The booklet clearly investigated everything she had done in Xiling all these years. After all, even if Su Zuidi changed her name in Xiling, it was not considered too conspicuous. But in the end she was still the Emperor of Xiling's most beloved concubine. How could she completely disappear in front of everyone's eyes? As long as they knew that Bai Long was Su Zuidi, it would be easy to investigate her background. Su Zuidi put down the booklet in her hand somewhat dispiritedly. She glanced at Yi Li who had a calm expression and felt even more embarrassed in her heart. Xu Yao knows all these? Yi Li said, I was just about to send it to him in a while. I won't allow you to show it to him. Su Zuidi screamed. Zhuojing and Lin Han who were at the side frowned at the same time. Looking at the stunning beauty who had finally lost her composure, their eyes were even more disapproving. Their princess consort had never lost her composure and acted so disrespectfully. Chapter 334. Yi Li picked up the tea on the table and took a sip. The slightly bitter herbal tea made her frown slightly. She raised her eyes and asked in confusion, Why? In short, I won't allow you to show it to him. Su Zuidi said firmly. Yi Li said indifferently, Imperial Concubine Bai has misunderstood. What this concubine is saying is, why does Imperial Concubine Bai think that this concubine will listen to you? Su Zuidi's face turned green and white. After a while she finally calmed down. She sat down again and even elegantly raised her hand to brush the white clothes on her body. She smiled sweetly at Yi Li and said, I know that the princess is jealous of me, right? That's right, after all I grew up with Xu Yao. Even if I was immature and left him in the past, now that I'm back, Xu Yao will forgive me sooner or later. Are you scared? Yi Li silently glanced at Su Zuidi, then lowered her head and continued to look at the booklet on the table. Su Zuidi covered her mouth and chuckled, saying, Xu Yao and I grew up together since we were young. He has never been willing to let me tire myself out to do anything. Seeing that you've worked so hard, when I reconcile with Xu Yao in the future, I will leave you a place to stay. Yi Li rubbed the space between her eyebrows and looked at the woman in front of her who was happily directing and acting. She curled her lips and said, Go and invite the prince over. Tell him that Imperial Concubine Bai is suffering from hysteria. Zhuojing's expression twisted, then he quickly got up and dashed off. Emo Shuyao arrived very quickly. When he came in, Su Zuidi was staring at Yi Li in a daze. Su Zuidi now somewhat believed Genom of Gojoseon's words. Yi Li was definitely the most difficult woman to deal with in her life. Whether it was Imperial Concubine Lu who was almost on par with her in the Chu capital, or the former empress who almost killed her in the Emperor of Xiling's palace, or even the current empress, they were all completely different from Yili. Suzuki boasted that she had seen many people in her life, but she had never seen a woman like Yili. Whether it was sowing discord or angering her, it was completely useless against her. It was as if she could not be angry or jealous at all. Facing her, Suzuki even felt like a clown. Shuyao. Seeing Emo Shuyao enter, Suzuki blinked and went up to greet him. Emo Shuyao stood at the door. His gaze swept over her and quickly landed on Yili, who was still sitting behind the desk. He asked softly, "Lili, what's wrong?" Yili casually used her chin to point at Suzuki, who was standing at the side and looking at Emo Shuyao pitifully. Emo Shuyao walked to Yili's side and sat down. "Lili, do as you see fit. I am in the middle of a discussion with General Liu and the others." Yili raised her eyebrows and smiled, saying, "I don't dare." Imperial concubine Bai and the prince grew up together. No matter what, there is still some friendship between them. Emo Shuyao raised his eyebrows, saying, "I was the second son of the Ding King when I was young. How could I grow up together with the young miss of the Bai family of West Hill?" Yili narrowed her eyes at him. "Then Imperial concubine Bai? Isn't Imperial concubine Bai a captive that we caught? Speaking of which, letting a captive run around the residence is your dereliction of duty." "Li," Emo Shuyao said with a smile. "Qiao, you treat me as a captive?" Suzuki's body trembled and she asked with a miserable expression. Emo Shuyao said lightly, "You are the Imperial concubine of West Hill, not a captive. Could it be that I colluded with the enemy, betrayed the country and hid in the enemy's royal family?" "You are so cruel." Suzuki looked at the two people sitting side by side in front of her with a resentful expression, tears falling like rain. Emo Shuyao sneered and said indifferently, "Put away your appearance. It is a waste to use it on I. I thought that Han Mingyue had told you what I said. Or, you thought that I was joking?" Suzuki trembled. That's right, Han Mingyue had said it. But she was too confident in her appearance and always thought that it was because Emo Shuyao had not seen her for too long. As long as Emo Shuyao saw her in person, he would definitely forgive her. Emo Shuyao said with a smile, "It's good that you showed up yourself. I was worried that there was no place to find Han Mingyue. Stay in the mansion obediently for the next few days. When Han Mingyue arrives, I will deal with you together." Suzuki was stunned for a moment and then asked, "In your eyes, am I not as important as Han Mingyue? Do you hate me so much that you won't forgive me no matter what?" Emo Shuyao said, "Han Mingyue is the head of the Tianyi Pavilion, and her spies are all over the world. What are you?" This time Suzuki really believed that Emo Shuyao did not care about her. Han Mingyue was the head of the Tianyi Pavilion, and whether as a friend or an enemy, she was someone that Emo Shuyao would not ignore. But what was she? The most beautiful woman in the world. If Emo Shuyao could really be captivated by her beauty, how could she be so cruel as to leave him in the first place? "I love you," Suzuki murmured softly. No matter how many men she had, even she herself could not deny that the only one she could truly love was the man in front of her. Emo Shuyao glanced regretfully at Yili, who was sitting beside him with her chin propped up and watching the show. Yili had never said that she loved him. These words were said by Yili. Just thinking about it, Emo Shuyao felt that his heart was filled with happiness and joy. The joy in his heart seemed to be about to burst out of his chest. "Shuyao." Seeing that Emo Shuyao was lost in thought, Suzuki thought that he was wavering, and happily stepped forward to pull him. Emo Shuyao lowered his eyes and did not even look at Suzuki's hand, saying, "Since Yili said that you have hysteria, go see a doctor. Shuijing, invite the doctor to Imperial concubine Bai's courtyard later." Shuijing stood up and replied, "This subordinate obeys. Imperial concubine Bai, please." Suzuki gritted her teeth and waved Shuijing's hand away. She turned to glare at Emo Shuyao and said bitterly, "I know, you will never forgive me, will you? Since that is the case, I might as well just die like this." After saying that, she turned around and slammed her head against the pillar next to her. Shuijing was standing just a step away from her, and he could have grabbed her with a raise of his hand. But she did not know what Shuijing was thinking, and he put his hand back down before he could touch Suzuki's clothes. Thus, with a bang, a bloody mark was left on the pillar. Suzuki's body went limp and slowly slid to the ground, the blood on her forehead flowing down her cheeks. Suzuki looked up at Emo Shuyao, who was still sitting beside Yili, and said with gritted teeth, You are so cruel." Looking at the unconscious Suzuki, Yili sighed in her heart. If she did not know what kind of person Su Zuidi was, Yili would not be able to help but pity her. Su Zuidi was cruel to herself, but she was also very unlucky. She had miscalculated the degree of cruelty Emo Shuyao had towards her. How could the second in line to the throne of the Ding Kingdom, the current prince of the Ding Kingdom, be a kind person who would repay evil with good? Yili did not dare to say that she knew a lot about people like Emo Shuyao, but at least she knew a little about him. Love wants one to live, hate wants one to die. If she was Su Zuidi, she would never choose to appear in front of Emo Shuyao again in this lifetime. Emo Shuyao looked at her face that was stained with blood with some regret and sighed, I don't know if she will be disfigured. Emo Shuyao looked at her with a smile. Is Lili worried about her? Chapter 335. Yili glanced at him and said with a cold laugh, No, this Fae is rejoicing in your misfortune. Emo Shuyao nodded and said in understanding, I understand. Li is jealous. We do not worry. In Ai's eyes, other than Li, there is no other woman at this time. Yili snorted lightly and ignored Emo Shuyao. But from the slight curve of her lips, it was possible to see a hint of joy. Emo Shuyao sighed inside and pondered how to get Li to admit that she loved him. Lin Han and Zhuijing tactfully retreated to find people to bring the unconscious beauty back to her own courtyard for treatment. Wang Fei had no interest in paying attention to her, and the prince did not seem to be in the mood to pay attention to her. Even though the wound on her forehead did not appear to be life-threatening, but if she was unlucky, there would be one less beauty in the world. The courtyard that Su Zuidi was temporarily living in was a small and remote courtyard in the governor's fu. The governor's fu was not large compared to the residences of the Wang Fu and high officials in Jing. It was very spacious when the governor's family had lived there. But now the governor of Xinyang City had disappeared. Not only did Emo Shuyao and Yili move in, there was also Marquis Nan and the others as well as most of the high-ranking generals stationed in Xinyang City. This way, Su Zuidi was able to be given a small courtyard in a remote corner of the inner courtyard. It was already preferential treatment. Waking up from her sleep, Su Zuidi reflexively touched her forehead. The thick gauze on her forehead and the clear pain caused her to feel both hate and regret. It was very much like Emo Shuyao's heartlessness. She knew very well how powerful Emo Shuyao's martial arts were. As long as Emo Shuyao did not want her to die, she would not be able to hit the pillar. She regretted her impulsiveness. If she ruined her beauty because of this. Thinking about this, Su Zuidi hurriedly got off the bed and leapt towards the bronze mirror on the table. This small courtyard was probably the residence of an unfavored concubine of the governor's residence. Although there was no lack of women's necessities, it was completely different from what Su Zuidi was used to. These items were not exquisite at all. Even the bronze mirror was blurry and indistinct. Su Zuidi stared for a long time, but all she could see was a blurry shadow on the bronze mirror and a thick white cloth wrapped around her forehead. In a moment of panic, Su Zuidi reached out to remove the white cloth on her head. Miss Bai, you can't undo it. The maid who was serving Su Zuidi came in from outside and just happened to see her actions. She hurriedly stepped forward to stop her. Impudent. After living like a princess for so many years, who dared to be so rude to her? Su Zuidi snapped. The maidservant was startled and hurriedly said, The doctor said that young miss must not touch it before the injury is healed. It would be bad if it left a scar. Hearing the girl's words, Su Zuidi finally calmed down. She stared at her and asked, You mean there won't be any scars on my face? The maidservant hesitated, then nodded and said, As long as Miss Bai recuperates well, it should not be. After receiving the maidservant's repeated affirmation, Su Zuidi finally relaxed. She sat in front of the bronze mirror and looked at her face in the blurry bronze mirror. She asked, Who sent me back? The little maidservant said, It was Xue Darren and Lin Darren who sent people to send young miss back. Su Zuidi's hand paused. The prince did not come to see me? The maidservant looked at her strangely but still respectfully replied, Young miss, the prince did not come. Hearing Su Zuidi throw the comb in her hand onto the table with a clatter, the little maidservant cautiously took 2 steps back. She was originally a maidservant of the governor's residence. Although she had escaped in the chaos of the war, she had no home to return to. Fortunately, the Wang Fei was kind enough to let her stay in the fu. She had been sent to serve this beautiful Miss Bai. She had been happy after all, To be able to see such a beauty was a blessing. But after a few days she felt that this Miss Bai was very strange. When she heard the Wang Fei call Miss Bai Gui Fei Bai, even though she didn't know which Gui Fei she was, she still respectfully called her. But she didn't expect Miss Bai to fly into a rage and insist that she call her Miss Su. But Zhuo Darren had said that the guest's surname was Bai. So she could only take a step back and call her Miss Bai. And Miss Bai always intimately mentioned the prince from time to time. Even though she was an ignorant maidservant, she could see that the prince's feelings for Miss Bai were not as warm as he was for the Wang Fei. Damn it! I don't believe that you don't have me in your heart at all. Looking dazedly at the blurry face in the bronze mirror, Su Zuodi frowned in disgust and said, "Go get a better mirror." Very quickly, Yi Li and Mo Xiuyao didn't have the mind to pay attention to Su Zuodi's tantrum, because a shocking piece of news came from Jing. The emperor had thrown the entire Southern Marquis Fu into the prison on the charge of Southern Marquis and Southern Marquis Shitzi for treason. The emperor had already sent people to the border to escort Southern Marquis and Southern Marquis Shitzi back to Jing. Hearing this news, Southern Marquis instantly fell to the ground in shock. He couldn't say a word for a long time. After a long time he gave a deep sigh. He had been low-key and cautious his entire life, but he hadn't thought that he still couldn't escape the emperor's suspicions. Southern Marquis Shitzi stood and was about to charge out when he was stopped by Yi Li and Mo Xiuyao at the door. Yi Li asked, "Where is Shitzi going?" Southern Marquis Shitzi said, "It's all because of my Southern Marquis Fu that has been implicated. I'm going to Jing to ask for forgiveness from the emperor." Before Yi Li and Mo Xiuyao could speak, Southern Marquis' angry voice came from inside the door. "Unfilial son. Come back here." Looking at the absent-minded Southern Marquis Shitzi, Yi Li sighed and said, "Let's go back first. Let's hear what the Marquis has to say." Shitzi was impulsive. Southern Marquis Shitzi forced a smile and said, "What kind of Shitzi am right now?" The emperor had thrown the entire Southern Marquis Fu into prison and removed Southern Marquis from his position as Marquis. Southern Marquis Shitzi was no longer Shitzi. Stepping into the reception pavilion, Southern Marquis came forward and cupped his hands, saying, "Prince Wang Fei, I've embarrassed myself." In the past month, Southern Marquis had suffered too many blows. He had been on a long journey and was tired. Even though Southern Marquis Shitzi had gotten better after returning, Southern Marquis Shitzi still looked weak. His originally gray hair was now almost completely white. Yi Li softly said, "Marquis, take care." Southern Marquis shook his head and forced a smile, saying, "Since ancient times, accompanying the emperor is like accompanying a tiger. Even though I don't want to get involved, I can't avoid." Before he finished, he let out a long sigh. Mo Xiuyao said in a low voice, "I have implicated Marquis Shitzi. To say that Southern Marquis had colluded with the enemy and committed treason, let alone Mo Xiuyao, even Mo Jingqi who was sitting in the palace wouldn't believe it." However, Southern Marquis Shitzi had been rescued by the Ding King Fu. In the emperor's eyes, the Southern Marquis Fu and the Ding King Fu were on the same side. Furthermore, all these years, Southern Marquis Shitzi had pretended to be deaf and mute, not helping the emperor deal with the Prince Ding mansion. To the emperor, this was a kind of disloyalty. At this time, the emperor would no longer trust the Southern Marquis Fu. Southern Marquis forced a smile and said, "Prince, why do you say this? This Marquis is cowardly by nature and only wants to stay out of things. If it weren't for Quan, I'm afraid I wouldn't be willing to step into this mess. People who try in vain to benefit from both sides. Today's retribution is reaping what they sowed." Chapter 336. "Marquis, you don't have to belittle yourself like this." Mo Xiuyao shook his head. When Marquis Nan was young, he also had a time when he was in high spirits. In the following years, the regent Mo Lufeng died mysteriously and the previous emperor passed away suddenly. After that, Mo Xiuan also suddenly contracted a disease and tens of thousands of Mahist army perished at the border. Marquis Nan was a smart person. He saw things clearly and thought more. After seeing more and thinking more, he naturally became afraid. That was why Marquis Nan, who did not care about worldly affairs, appeared. Marquis Nan shook his head and did not speak. Yi Li frowned as she looked at Marquis Nan's gloomy face and his eyes were desolate. He was shocked. Marquis Nan probably had the will to die. "Marquis, as long as you are alive, there is hope. Don't forget that the Nan Marquis estate is still waiting for Marquis Nan's rescue. The heir also needs Marquis Nan's guidance." I hope Marquis Nan will take care. Marquis Nan was startled. He looked at the Nan Marquis heir standing beside him and a determined expression flashed across his face. He said, "This Marquis will return to the capital now. I hope Prince and Princess can take care of him. Marquis Nan, please reconsider." Yili frowned. If Marquis Nan brought the Nan Marquis heir back to the capital, the result might be death, but there was still a chance of survival. But if he left the Nan Marquis heir in the army and returned to the capital alone, he might not be able to return. Marquis Nan raised his hand to stop Yili. He said, "Thank you, Princess, for your good intentions. But, the current emperor, this old man has watched him grow up. Compared to the prince and princess, this old man knows him better. Prince, the Ding royal estate has been loyal to the Dechu state for generations. I shouldn't have said this, but now there is no difference. As for the emperor, Prince should make plans early." The parlor was silent for a moment. Marquis Nan had already made it clear that returning to the capital was a dead end, but he still wanted to go back. Nan Marquis heir said in a low voice, "Father, I will go back with you." Marquis Nan glared at him. "Nonsense. If I don't return, do you want the Nan family line to end?" "Father." "Prince, there are people from the capital. They said they are escorting Marquis Nan and Marquis Nan's son back to the capital." The guard outside reported. Emo Xiuyao stood up and sneered, "I just received the news and the people from the capital have already arrived. Your Majesty has improved. Who is the visitor?" The imperial bodyguard replied, "Replying to Your Majesty, it is the Minister of the Supreme Court, Wang Jingchuan." Emo Xiuyao frowned. Wang Jingchuan? Prince Ding was busy with a myriad of affairs every day. Naturally, he would not have any impression of such a minor character. Marquis Nan smiled bitterly and said, "He is Wang Xiaorong's elder brother from the palace, the second legitimate son of the Wang family." Emo Xiuyao frowned and understood. Although the southern Marquis estate was neutral, it didn't mean that they didn't have any enemies. It just so happened that the Wang family and the southern Marquis estate didn't get along. The emperor had sent such a person to escort Marquis Nan and his son back to the capital. His intention to make things difficult and humiliate them was self-evident. Emo Xiuyao gave a light snort and said, "Let him in." Not long after, a young man dressed in the uniform of a third-rank official walked in. This person's appearance could be considered not bad, but there was an air of hostility between his brows that made people feel that he wasn't a good person. Behind him was a young man dressed in the uniform of a seventh-rank official. Yili looked at the person and raised an eyebrow. "This subject, Minister of the Supreme Court Wang Jingchuan, greets the Prince Wang Jingchuan." Wang Jingchuan knew the severity of the situation. After entering, he immediately bowed to Emo Xiuyao and Yili. The young man behind him also bowed. "This subject, Minister of the Supreme Court, Shou Yu, greets the Prince Wang Jingchuan." Emo Xiuyao sat in his seat. He looked down at the two people on the ground and said lightly, "Rise. Why has official Wang come?" Wang Jingchuan stood up. His eyes flashed with a trace of pride as he said, "Reporting to Prince, this official has come under the Emperor's orders to escort the traitors Nan Yi and Nan Junfei back to the capital." Emo Xiuyao raised an eyebrow. "Traitors?" Marquis Nan is Ai's deputy commander. Although the Marquis Nan's heir was defeated and captured, he still returned safely. After that, he repeatedly performed meritorious service in battle. Who is the traitor official Wang is talking about? Where is the evidence? Wang Jingchuan clearly didn't expect Emo Xiuyao to ask such a question. He was stunned for a moment before saying, "Prince, this is the Emperor's intention. Could it be that Prince wants to defy the imperial decree?" Emo Xiuyao sneered, "Defy the imperial decree? Where is the imperial decree? I heard that the Wang family and the Marquis estate have some grudges. I suspect that you are falsifying the imperial decree with the intention of harming the Marquis. Prince, please be careful with your words. Even if this official has a grudge with the Marquis estate, I wouldn't dare to do such a disgraceful thing." "Where is the imperial decree?" Emo Xiuyao asked faintly. Wang Jingchuan choked. Facing Emo Xiuyao's aggressive gaze, he could only say, "The Emperor gave an oral decree." "Oral decree?" Emo Xiuyao looked at the uneasy man in front of him with a faint smile and didn't say anything else. Wang Jingchuan lowered his head and stood uneasily in the hall. The entire hall suddenly seemed abnormally quiet. Under Prince Ding's gaze, Wang Jingchuan felt as if he could hear the sound of his heart beating out of his chest. A large patch of the back of his clothes was silently drenched. Just as Wang Jingchuan thought that he would collapse under Prince Ding's pressure, Zhou Yu, who was standing behind him, walked out. He bowed to Mo Shuyao and said respectfully, "Prince, please calm your anger. This official is just following orders. I ask Prince to make things easier." "Following orders?" Mo Shuyao said with a playful smile. Wang Jingchuan clearly felt Prince Ding's gaze move away from him. He couldn't help but sigh in his heart. Wiping away the fine beads of sweat on his forehead, Wang Jingchuan was even grateful to this somewhat taciturn young subordinate of his. Mo Shuyao said with a smile, "Following orders? Originally, I shouldn't have made things difficult for you. However, I'm sure you've heard of a saying. Prince, please guide us." Wang Jingchuan wasn't an idiot. No matter how happy he was that the Marquis estate was unlucky, he didn't care. Since Prince Ding wasn't happy right now, he didn't need to show off his happiness. Of course, the emperor would definitely stand on his side. However, if Prince Ding were to kill him in a fit of anger, the emperor was far away and the Wang family wouldn't be able to hold their noses and accept it. Mo Shuyao looked at the two with a smile and said casually, "When a general is away, the emperor's orders are not to be followed." Wang Jingchuan paused and said with some difficulty, "Prince, I have come under orders. Please don't make things difficult for me, Prince." Mo Shuyao looked at him with an indifferent expression. Wang Jingchuan felt bitter in his heart. He secretly regretted that he had wanted to see his sworn enemy fall and snatch this job. Not to mention that he was just a third-level official, even if it was the first-level Prince Ding, who would dare to say no if he wanted to make things difficult for him. However, if he couldn't bring the Marquis and his son back, his good days would probably come to an end when he returned to the capital. "Right now, our army is at war with Xiling. Rashly removing the deputy commander will be detrimental to the army's morale. Official Wang, when you return to the capital, tell the emperor this. If the emperor blames you, Official Wang can push the blame to I." Mo Shuyao clearly had no interest in making things difficult for Wang Jingchuan and said indifferently. Wang Jingchuan shook his head and said, "Prince, please forgive me. Marquis Nan's crime of treason cannot be forgiven. The emperor is already furious. He ordered me to bring the Marquis and his son back to the capital within half a month. Otherwise, I can only take my head to see the emperor. Prince, please be magnanimous and give me a way out." Mo Shuyao raised his eyebrows and laughed coldly. What a crime of treason. Chapter 337. This. Wang Jingchuan hesitated with some unwillingness. Mo Shuyao said lightly, "Official Wang doesn't trust one?" Wang Jingchuan was shocked and quickly said, "I don't dare. To tell you the truth, Prince, the emperor has decreed that if Marquis Nan and his son don't return to the capital within 15 days, regardless of age or gender, the head of the Nan Marquis estate will fall." On the side, Yili sighed in her heart. The emperor had made up his mind to kill the Nan Marquis estate. The lives of the Nan Marquis family members would be in danger before Nan Marquis returned. Even if they wanted to rush back to save them now, it would be too late. Most importantly, with the Prince Ding mansion's current position, it was impossible to secretly save them. If they wanted to ask the emperor to spare them, they could only ask Mo Shuyao to personally return to the capital. But with the current war, it was even more impossible. Just as they were thinking, Nan Marquis suddenly walked out from the inner room and said calmly, "I will follow you back to the capital." Wang Jingchuan looked at Mo Shuyao. If Prince Ding didn't agree, even if Nan Marquis was willing to go with him, he wouldn't be able to take him away. Nan Marquis turned to Mo Shuyao and bowed. "Prince, I don't know when we'll meet again. Everything. I'll leave it to Prince." Mo Shuyao was silent for a moment and sighed, "I'm sorry, Mark. Right now he couldn't return to the capital to deal with this matter." Nan Marquis shook his head, "It's fate. It has nothing to do with Prince. I will take my leave now." He turned to Wang Jingchuan and said, "Official Wang, please." Wang Jingchuan looked at Marquis Nan, his eyes turned and he said, "Marquis Nan, if this official remembers correctly, your son is also here." Marquis Nan smiled indifferently and said, "This Marquis does not know what Sir is talking about." In front of Mo Shuyao, Wang Jingchuan didn't dare to be too presumptuous. He took a deep breath and said to Mo Shuyao, "Since Prince won't interfere, I ask Prince to invite Nan Marquis heir out as well." I will also take my leave and return to the capital. Yili said indifferently, this consort has never seen the southern marquis heir. Wang Jingchuan was stunned and frowned. Why is Wang Fei deceiving herself? Marquis Nan's son was captured by the West Hill and later rescued by the princess. How could Wang Fei not have seen him before? Yili smiled faintly and said, Lord Wang has just arrived from the capital, yet you know so much. You are truly well informed. However, Lord Wang's information might be a little off. This consort has indeed never met the southern marquis heir. Or, does Lord Wang wish to search the governor's mansion in Suncreed City? Wang Jingchuan quickly glanced at Prince Ding, who sat beside him with a cold expression and shook his head. Even if the southern marquis crown prince was really in the governor's residence, he did not have the guts to search. Moreover, Suncreed City, the governor's mansion, and even the cities in the northwest were all under Prince Ding's control. Who could be sure that the southern marquis heir was definitely here? If he could not find him, an angered Prince Ding, Wang Jingchuan was once again certain that he had taken on a hot potato this time. Wang Fei is right. I have never seen the southern marquis heir. Since you want to escort the southern marquis back to the capital, I will not keep you. Also, since you are in a hurry, I will send 2 shadow guards to escort you back to the capital. Wang Jingchuan's heart trembled and he could only say, if that is the case, this humble subject will take his leave. Seeing the southern marquis turn and leave without any reluctance, Yili sighed inwardly and stood up to send him off. Take care, Mark. The southern marquis' smile had a rare trace of carefreeness. He smiled and said, many thanks, Wang Fei. Prince, take care. After sending off the southern marquis heir rushed out with a face full of tears. Zhuojing and Lin Han followed behind him, their faces full of helplessness. If they had not pulled the southern marquis heir, they would have rushed out already. Seeing the southern marquis heir rush out the door, Yili stood up and asked, where are you going? The southern marquis heir paused. Zhuojing and Lin Han had already blocked his path on the left and right. The southern marquis heir turned his head and said, as a son and a husband, how can I watch my parents, wife and children be wrongly imprisoned? Moreover, this matter started because of me. Yili walked in front of him and said indifferently, what's the use of rushing out now? Apart from one more person being thrown into prison and escorted to the execution grounds? Or do you want to go to the emperor to explain? Do you think the emperor will give you this opportunity? The southern marquis heir painfully covered his face. How could he not understand what Yili was saying? But right now he was going to accompany his father back to the capital. He was going to accompany his family and face this together. What else could he do? Southern marquis, there may be a way out. Looking at them, Emo Xiuyao frowned slightly. The southern marquis heir looked at Emo Xiuyao in surprise. Emo Xiuyao frowned and said, Duke Hua has the iron scroll that Emperor Gaozong bestowed upon the Hua family. Even the death penalty can be avoided. But the southern marquis heir hesitated. He had heard of the iron scroll, but in this dynasty only the Hua family who had saved Emperor Gaozong's life had been bestowed a copy. Even the Ding king's residence, which had protected the country for generations, did not have such a thing. But with such a valuable item, the Hua family. Emo Xiuyao lowered his eyes and said, Duke Hua will not be stingy with a dead object. I'm afraid. He was afraid that if Emo Jingqi was determined to take the southern marquis life, even if the iron scroll saved him, he would not be able to escape death. Yili clearly thought of Emo Xiuyao's concerns. She nodded slightly and said to Lin Han, send a letter to Emo Hua. Tell him to do his best to protect the southern marquis. The southern marquis heir gradually calmed down. He bowed to the two and said, Nan Junfei thanks the princess. Yili shook her head and said, Heir, there is no need to be so courteous. The southern marquis heir smiled bitterly and said, my name is Junfei. In the future, prince, please call me by my name. I am no longer an heir. Princess, just now Lord Zhou left a letter for you. The guard outside the door presented a sealed letter. Yili raised her brows. She took the letter and looked at it curiously. There was no problem. Lord Zhou. The guard nodded and said, just now before he left, Lord Zhou privately gave this letter to me. He asked me to pass it to Prince. Emo Xiuyao frowned and said, does Yili know Zhou Yu? When Zhou Yu came in, Yili's expression showed a trace of surprise. Although it was fleeting, Emo Xiuyao, who had been paying attention to her, still saw it. Yili shook her head and said, He should be this year's Jinshi. We met once last year. Even if Yi Li's memory wasn't photographic, it wasn't too far off. As soon as Zhou Yu spoke, she remembered that it was the scholar who sold paintings at Shendexian last year. She did not expect that not only did he pass the Jinshi exam, he also became a registrar of the Supreme Court. Although his position was not high, it was a real vacancy. As long as his ability and luck were not too bad, he should have a good future. Opening the letter, Yi Li lowered her head to read it. Her expression immediately changed. She silently handed the letter to Emo Shuyao. Emo Shuyao looked at it and his originally unhappy expression immediately darkened. He slapped the table and stood up. He said sternly, "Someone. Immediately chase after Marquis Nan. Kill anyone who dares to stop you." Zhuojing and Lin Han's expressions changed. They responded in unison and quickly walked out. Nan Junfei also knew that something had happened. His expression changed and he also followed Zhuojing and Lin Han out. Only Emo Shuyao and Yi Li were left in the hall. The atmosphere became even heavier. Seeing Emo Xuyao's dark expression, Yi Li did not say anything. She silently sat to the side and looked at him. After a long time, Emo Shuyao seemed to have finally awakened from his extreme anger. There was a trace of tiredness and helplessness between his brows. Picking up the letter on the table again, Emo Shuyao looked at Yi Li with a bitter smile and said, "Li, I'm so tired." Yi Li silently leaned on his shoulder and gently patted him on the shoulder. Emo Shuyao reached out a hand to hug the person sitting beside him. He absorbed the faint warmth from her body, but he was unable to resist the chill that rose from the bottom of his heart. Looking at the letter in his hand that was filled with familiar handwriting, was the Ding Palace really hated to such an extent? But the emperor, aren't you afraid that Dechu state will be destroyed?